Tonight, we're diving into the darkest, quietest mysteries of the wizarding world, the ones that were never truly solved, only buried under the passing of years and the silence of the people who might have explained them. Settle in now, let your shoulders soften, and let the room around you grow dim and warm. There is nothing here that can reach you, only a slow and even voice moving through old shadows that have waited a very long time for someone to simply sit with them. If these long, quiet tellings are the ones that finally carry you under, a gentle subscribe keeps them coming, night after night, and that is the only small thing I will ask of you before we begin. Over the next 20 chapters we will follow, without haste, the threads that the history books left hanging. A death in a small house that no one ever fully explained. A diadem lost for centuries. A ghost who was once a girl with a very different kind of grief. A prison built on an island for reasons no one wrote down. And a mirror that should never have been able to exist at all. You do not need to solve any of it, and none of it can touch you where you are. Let it move through you like a slow tide, and let it carry you, softly, down toward rest. Let us begin where the darkest of these stories always begins, in a small stone house at the edge of a village called Godric's Hollow, long before anyone had heard the name Harry Potter, long before anyone thought to wonder what secrets that quiet village might already be keeping. This is the story of a girl named Ariana Dumbledore, and it is, even now, the saddest and least settled of all the mysteries we will walk through together tonight. Ariana was the youngest child of Percival and Kendra Dumbledore, born after her brothers Albus and Aberforth, into a family that seemed, for a little while, like any other magical family of its time. She was gentle by every account that survives her, a soft and watchful child. But when she was somewhere around 6 or 7 years old, 3 Muggle boys from the village saw her doing magic in the garden behind her home. What exactly they saw was never recorded. What is known is that they did not react with wonder. They reacted with fear, and then with cruelty, and what they did to her that day was never fully written down anywhere. Not in any account that has reached us, only spoken of afterward in the smallest and most careful of terms, as though even naming it too plainly might do her a second harm. Whatever happened in that garden broke something in her that never mended. The books tell us only that the trauma was so severe it damaged her magic itself, turning what should have been a natural, growing gift into something wild and unpredictable. Something that came out of her in fits she could not control and did not choose. She became, in the plainest words available to us, unstable, and at times, without meaning to be, dangerous, not out of any cruelty of her own, but because whatever lived inside her now answered to no one, not even to herself. Her father, Percival Dumbledore, did not let this pass quietly. He found the 3 Muggle boys responsible, and in his grief and his fury, he attacked them. For this he was arrested, tried, and convicted, and it is here that the story folds in on itself in a way that has never fully been undone. At his trial, Percival never explained what had truly been done to his daughter, never told the court why he had done what he did. He let the wizarding world believe only that he was a dangerous man who had attacked children without cause, and he carried that silence with him all the way to Azkaban, where he would eventually die, still protecting a truth that was never his secret alone to give away. Whether he judged the silence a fair price to keep his daughter from being taken and studied and exposed, or whether it was simply the only choice left to a broken man, is something the record does not answer, and something we will simply have to sit with, unresolved, the way his own family had to sit with it for the rest of their lives. With her husband gone, Kendra Dumbledore made a decision of her own. She moved what remained of her family to Godric's Hollow away from the village where the attack had happened. And there, she began a long and quiet campaign of concealment. She told neighbors that Ariana was too delicate to be seen, too unwell for company, and she kept her youngest daughter almost entirely hidden from the world for years, allowing only the smallest circle of people to know she existed at all. It is impossible now to separate how much of this was shame and how much of it was simple protection, a mother trying to keep her fragile child safe from a world that had already shown once how it might respond to her. Perhaps it was both at once, woven together so tightly that even Kendra herself might not have been able to say where one ended and the other began. That quiet arrangement held for years. In that small house at the edge of the village, 3 children growing up around a secret their mother carried almost entirely alone. And then, one evening whose exact details were never recorded in full, something in Ariana's magic slipped loose during what is believed to have been one of her episodes, and Kendra Dumbledore was killed. Some accounts describe an explosion, a burst of magic she could not contain. But no witness ever set down precisely what happened in that room. And so, the death of Kendra Dumbledore joins her daughter's suffering as another piece of this family's history that has never been fully explained, only inherited, quietly, by the children left behind. Albus Dumbledore was in his final year at Hogwarts when word reached him of his mother's death. He returned home to Godric's Hollow, and with that return, the brilliant future that had seemed to open so easily before him narrowed, almost overnight, into something smaller and heavier. As the eldest, the responsibility for Ariana and for his younger brother Aberforth now fell to him, and by every account we have, he did not turn away from it, not at first. He came home, and he stayed. It was that same summer, not long after his mother's death, in the months before his 17th birthday would have carried him fully into adulthood, that a young man named Gellert Grindelwald arrived in Godric's Hollow to stay with his great-aunt, Bathilda Bagshot, who lived in the village, and who in time would introduce the 2 young men to one another. What followed between Albus Dumbledore and Gellert Grindelwald that summer has been picked over by historians and gossips alike ever since. But what seems clear, from every surviving letter and every later admission, is that the 2 of them found in each other something rare, a matching brilliance, a matching hunger for ideas larger than either of them had been allowed to hold before. They spoke of a new order for wizardkind, of magical people no longer needing to hide themselves from the Muggle world, but ruling over it instead. All of it wrapped in a phrase they both came to lean on, that it would be done for the greater good, as if the phrase itself could carry the weight of what it was being asked to excuse. And in the glow of that friendship, in the long conversations that stretched late into those summer evenings, something else was quietly slipping. Ariana, fragile and needing careful, steady attention, began to receive less and less of it. Aberforth, who had never left home the way Albus once dreamed of doing, who had stayed close to his sister in a way his older brother had not, watched this happening and grew angry. And that anger did not stay quiet for long. It came to a head one afternoon in a confrontation between the 3 of them. Albus, Aberforth, and Grindelwald, voices rising, old resentments finally spoken aloud. And somewhere in the middle of that argument, wands were drawn. What is certain is only this: a curse flew during that confrontation, a curse meant for someone else entirely, and it did not reach its intended target. It struck Ariana instead, and she died there, in her own home, in the middle of a fight that was never supposed to be about her at all. And here is the mystery that this whole story has been leading toward, the one that has never once been resolved in all the years since. No one knows, with any certainty, whose curse it was that killed her. 3 wands were drawn that day, 3 young men caught in a moment of fury none of them could later fully account for, and by every honest telling that survives, including Albus Dumbledore's own words much later in his life. Even he himself was never certain it had not been his own curse that struck his sister down. He carried that uncertainty for the rest of his days, a private grief he rarely spoke of, a question he could never quite answer even to himself, and it is a question that remains open still, sitting quietly at the center of one of the saddest homes the wizarding world has ever known. Aberforth Dumbledore carried his own version of that night for the rest of his life, and his relationship with his older brother never fully recovered from it. Where Albus channeled his grief into decades of quiet, careful achievement, becoming perhaps the most respected wizard of his age, Aberforth withdrew from the wider wizarding world almost entirely, tending goats in the hills above Hogsmeade and later running a modest tavern, keeping his distance from a brother he blamed, at least in part, for the neglect that let that final confrontation happen at all. The two men barely spoke for years afterward, and even when they eventually reconciled enough to work toward common goals during the war against Voldemort, the old wound never fully closed, a private grief neither of them ever discussed openly with anyone else, including, as far as any surviving record shows, with each other. Up next in Chapter 2, Three Brothers and a Debt to Death, we'll uncover the death of a young girl in a quiet house in Godric's Hollow left behind more questions than answers. And those questions have a way of settling into the mind at night, the way a stone settles slowly to the bottom of a still pond. Ariana Dumbledore was gone, and the three men who might have known the whole truth of that afternoon chose, each in his own way, to carry it forward in silence rather than speak it aloud. It is a strange thing how grief can seal a story shut more completely than any lock or ward ever could. And it was Albus Dumbledore himself, in the long, quiet decades that followed, who returned again and again to an old and half-forgotten tale, one that he seemed to feel had something to teach him about death, and about the terrible temptation of trying to master it. That tale is where this chapter must begin, because it is one of the strangest, oldest riddles in the entire history of the wizarding world, and to this day, no one has ever settled what it truly is. The story is usually told as a children's fable, printed in a small book bound in soft leather, a book of tales collected long ago by a wandering storyteller named Beetle the Bard. Parents read it to their children before sleep, the way this very voice is reading to you now. It tells of three brothers, sons of the same family, who came one evening to a wide and dangerous river, one that had claimed the lives of many travelers who tried to cross it. Rather than risk the treacherous currents, the three brothers used their wands to conjure a bridge across the water, and it is said that as they reached the middle of that bridge, a cloaked figure rose up to meet them. The figure spoke, in the old telling, as death itself, robbed of the three lives it had expected to take from the river below, and cunning enough to offer each brother a gift instead, as though granting a prize rather than admitting a defeat. The eldest brother, Antioch, asked for a wand more powerful than any in existence, one that would win him every duel it was ever raised in. And so he was given a wand fashioned, it was said, from the wood of an elder tree. The second brother, Cadmus, prideful and grieving a lost love, asked for the power to bring back the dead, and he was given a small, plain stone with the power to summon a shadow of anyone who had died. The youngest brother, Ignotus, trusted the figure least of the three, and so he asked instead for a way to leave that place without being followed, and he was given a cloak of shimmering, silvery fabric, one that would hide its wearer from any eye, forever, as long as it was worn. The three brothers went their separate ways, and here the old fable turns quietly dark. in the way that the truest bedtime stories often do, carrying inside them a small, sober lesson about the dangers of wanting too much. Antioch, proud of his unbeatable wand, could not resist boasting of it in the village where he settled, and it was not many nights before another man, drawn by greed and rumor, slit his throat as he slept and took the wand for himself. Cadmus returned home and used his stone to call back the woman he had once hoped to marry. But the shade that answered his summons was cold and sad and distant, not truly alive, only a thin echo of the girl he remembered, and unable to bear the sorrow of loving something that could not return his love. He took his own life so that he might join her properly. Only Ignotus, the youngest, lived quietly under his cloak, asking for nothing more than an ordinary life, and he grew old in peace, surrounded by his family. And when his own death finally came, he greeted it, it is said, as an old friend, and passed his cloak down to his son before he went. That is the fable, as it has always been told, gentle and sorrowful, meant to teach that trying to outwit death only ever leads to ruin. But the deepest mystery of this story is not in its moral at all. It lies in a question that has never once been settled by anyone who has studied it seriously, wizard or historian alike, and it is this: were the wand, the stone, and the cloak ever truly gifts from death, handed across a bridge by some cloaked and thinking figure? Or is it far more likely that Antioch, Cadmus, and Ignotus Peverell were simply three brothers of extraordinary magical skill, masters of a kind of ancient, difficult magic that has since been lost or forgotten, who crafted these three objects with their own hands and their own knowledge, and that the legend of death itself grew up afterward, wrapped around them the way ivy slowly wraps itself around old stone. No record has ever settled the matter one way or the other. It remains, quite simply, unknown, and it may always remain so. What is not in question, what history itself has been able to trace with far more certainty than any fable, is what became of the objects afterward, and that trail is perhaps stranger than the legend itself. The wand said to have been given to Antioch did not vanish into myth. It resurfaced again and again across the centuries, passing from one powerful and often dangerous owner to the next, almost always through violence, almost always by the same grim rule the story warned of, taken by whoever could defeat its previous master in a duel. It moved through the hands of dark and brilliant wizards alike for hundreds of years, until it came, quite unexpectedly, into the possession of Albus Dumbledore himself, and later, through paths only partly understood, into the hands of Lord Voldemort, who believed it would finally make him unstoppable. The stone said to have been given to Cadmus followed its own strange, quiet road. It was eventually set, without any of its later owners realizing what it truly was, into an old and ugly ring worn by the Gaunt family, a bloodline that had fallen very far from the greatness it once claimed. And that ring passed through their hands for generations before anyone understood its origin. Only the cloak, the third gift, followed a gentler and unbroken path. It stayed within the Peverell family and its descendants without ever once being lost, stolen, or fought over. Quietly handed from parent to child across the centuries, eventually resting, in the end, with the Potter family, worn by fathers and sons who mostly never guessed at the weight of its history. So the wand and the stone left long, bloody trails across the pages of history, each one traceable, each one real, while the cloak simply endured, peacefully, exactly as its first owner had wished for it to endure. And still, after all of it, after every duel and every grave and every quiet bedtime telling of the tale, No one has ever been able to say with certainty where the truth ends and the fable begins. Was there ever truly a figure on that bridge, or only three brothers, brilliant and mortal, who built something extraordinary and left the rest of the story to be written by those who came after them? It is one of the oldest unanswered questions the wizarding world has ever carried, and it may simply be one that was never meant to be answered at all. Let that uncertainty settle over you now, soft and unhurried, the way mist settles over a riverbank at dusk. There is no need to solve it tonight, or any night. Just let the old story rest, and let yourself rest along with it. Up next in Chapter 3, The Vanishing of the Ravenclaw Diadem, we'll uncover the centuries-long disappearance of one of the four founders' most treasured and powerful creations, and the quiet, aching story of the daughter who lost it long before anyone else ever did. Settle back in now, and let the last chapter go quiet in your mind. The Deathly Hallows have folded themselves back into legend, the Elder Wand and the Resurrection Stone, and the cloak drifting off into the dark like three small boats pulling away from shore. Tonight the story moves further back, past even the three brothers on their lonely road, to the founding of a castle on a windswept hill, and to a smaller, quieter kind of magic than a wand that never loses a duel. This is a story about wisdom, and about the terrible things that can grow in the shadow of it. This is the story of the Ravenclaw Diadem, and of the centuries in which the whole wizarding world simply forgot it existed. Long before Hogwarts had towers or ghosts or moving staircases, four witches and wizards walked its grounds together, each carrying a private vision of what a school of magic should be. Rowena Ravenclaw was, by every account left to history, the wisest of the four. She valued learning the way other people valued gold, and she wanted her students to be known not for their bravery or their ambition, but for the quality of their minds. Sometime during her life, Rowena crafted a diadem, a slender circlet meant to rest across the brow like a small crown. Into its making, she wove magic of extraordinary subtlety, so that whoever wore it would find their own wisdom sharpened and deepened. It was not a crown for ruling, it was a crown for thinking. Those who knew of it whispered that it could turn a clever mind into a brilliant one. Rowena treasured it above every other possession she owned, and she wore it, by most tellings, for the whole of her adult life. She had a daughter named Helena. And here the story turns from admiration to something sadder, something more human. Helena grew up in the shadow of a mother whose intellect was already legendary across magical Britain, whose name would be carved into the very stones of a school. To be raised beside brilliance and measured against it every single day did something quiet and corrosive to Helena's heart. She did not simply admire her mother's wisdom, she envied it. She wanted, more than anything else in the world, to possess something that would let her surpass the woman who had raised her, to be spoken of not as Rowena's daughter, but as someone greater in her own right. So, Helena did what envy so often persuades a person to do. She took what was not hers. One quiet day, while her mother was elsewhere in the castle, Helena lifted the diadem from where it rested and fled Hogwarts entirely, crossing the sea and putting an enormous distance between herself and everyone who had ever known her. She traveled all the way to Albania, to its wild forests, and there she settled, alone, wearing her mother's crown of wisdom upon her own head, believing that distance and secrecy would let her become, finally and completely, her own person, cleverer than the woman she had left behind. Rowena's grief at the loss of both her daughter and her diadem was profound, and she never recovered her health afterward. As her illness worsened, she found she could not simply let her daughter go without one final attempt to bring her home. There was a young man at the castle who loved Helena deeply, though his feelings had never quite been returned in the way he hoped. He was a nobleman then, alive and breathing, though history would come to know him only by the title he would receive many years later: the Bloody Baron. Dying and desperate, Rowena asked him to go and find her daughter, to bring Helena home to her, whatever it took, before it was too late. He went, crossing the same sea, searching the same forests, and eventually he found her, hidden away in her self-imposed exile, with the diadem still upon her head. What passed between them in that Albanian forest belongs to a darker chapter than this one, a chapter still to come. What matters here, for now, is only this: Helena did not return to Hogwarts wearing the crown that made her the daughter of a legend. She returned to Hogwarts as a ghost, one of the 4 spectral figures who would haunt its halls for the rest of the school's long history, silent about her past, silent above all about the diadem itself. And the diadem, the crown Rowena Ravenclaw had poured her genius into making, simply vanished from the world. This is where the true mystery begins, and it is a mystery that swallowed nearly 1,000 years. Nobody, in all the centuries that followed, knew what had become of Rowena Ravenclaw's diadem. It was not sold, not stolen by another hand, not melted down or broken apart. It simply disappeared, along with the only person who could say where it had gone. A ghost who kept her secret so completely that most students at Hogwarts did not even know she had once been Rowena's daughter at all. They knew her only as a pale, silent figure gliding along the corridors of Ravenclaw Tower, someone they called the Grey Lady, and few of them ever wondered what grief she was carrying, or what she had done with a small circlet of undying value on a night lost somewhere in the deep past. Generations of witches and wizards searched for the lost diadem of Ravenclaw. Scholars wrote about it as a legend, a treasure gone the way so many old and precious things go, into rumor and shadow, assumed by most to be destroyed, or hidden so well that it would never surface again. Century after century passed in this way, and nobody found it. Nobody found her secret either. The silence simply held, undisturbed, for roughly 1,000 years, an entire span of wizarding history in which one of the 4 founders' greatest creations lay somewhere in the world, unclaimed, unseen, and utterly unaccounted for. It held until a boy named Tom Riddle arrived at Hogwarts, a boy with an unusually persuasive tongue and an appetite for objects of power that went far beyond ordinary curiosity. Riddle noticed what almost nobody else at the school had ever bothered to notice, that the quiet, gray ghost of Ravenclaw Tower was Rowena's own daughter, and that she alone might know where the vanished diadem had gone. Where centuries of scholars had failed, Riddle succeeded through nothing more than charm and patient flattery, speaking to Helena with a warmth no one had shown her in 1,000 years, drawing her slowly out of her long silence until at last, gently, she told him what she had never told another living soul, where she had hidden her mother's diadem, deep in that same forest, in the hollow of a tree. Riddle retrieved it, and rather than returning it to the world, rather than letting the lost treasure of Ravenclaw be found again at last, he did something far darker. He turned the diadem into a Horcrux, binding a fragment of his own soul inside it, and then he carried it back to the very castle where it had first been made, and hid it away in a room known only to those who truly needed it, a chamber piled with centuries of forgotten, discarded, hidden things. There the diadem remained, tucked inside an old cabinet among broken quills and cracked bottles and other people's abandoned secrets, resting on the head of a stone bust in a room so vast and so cluttered that thousands of students would pass within feet of it, year after year, without the faintest idea of what stood among the rubbish around them. And so, the diadem entered its second great silence, longer even than the first. Rowena Ravenclaw's crown of wisdom, sought for nearly 1,000 years by scholars who never found it, sat quietly gathering dust, watched over by no one, known to no one, waiting once more to be forgotten by an entire school full of students who walked past it, never once guessing what rested so near to them in the dark. Up next in Chapter 4, The Lady Who Was Never a Ghost, we'll uncover what truly happened between Helena Ravenclaw and the Bloody Baron in that Albanian forest, and how a story of love and pride ended in the tragedy that made her a ghost forever. She was already far from the castle by the time anyone thought to look for her, the diadem folded into her cloak like a small, cold secret. Her footsteps swallowed by grass, and then by roads, and then, at last, by water. Helena Ravenclaw did not run the way a frightened girl runs. She moved the way a clever girl moves, choosing her path with the same care her mother had once chosen the words carved above the doorway of the school itself. And by the time the sun rose over Ravenclaw Tower, she was already someone else entirely. A traveler with no name attached to her, crossing toward a continent that had not yet learned what it would one day become famous for hiding. To understand what she did, it helps to sit for a moment with who she was before she did it. Helena was, by every account passed down through the centuries, brilliant in the particular way her mother was brilliant. Quick with ideas, quicker with words, the kind of mind that could hold an entire argument in the air and turn it slowly to find its weakest point. She had grown up inside the shadow of Rowena Ravenclaw, one of the 4 founders of the school, a woman so admired for her wisdom that an entire house was built around the pursuit of it. And it is here, in that shadow, that something quieter and darker had been growing in Helena for a very long time, unnoticed or perhaps simply unspoken, the way so many difficult things inside a family are allowed to go unspoken. She was jealous of her mother, not of her mother's love, which she seemed to have had, but of her mother's brilliance, of the particular kind of fame that comes to a person who is simply, undeniably, more remarkable than everyone around her. Helena wanted to be cleverer than Rowena Ravenclaw. And so, when the chance came to take the one object that made her mother's wisdom visible to the world, the diadem that was said to sharpen the mind of whoever wore it, she did not hesitate the way a loyal daughter might have hesitated. She took it, and she left. Her destination was Albania. The histories do not explain, in any satisfying way, why she chose that particular country, tucked into the edge of a Europe that still felt enormous and half-mapped in those centuries. Perhaps it was simply distance she wanted, a place far enough from her mother's reach that no owl, no messenger, no rumor could easily find her. Perhaps it was the forests, deep and old, the kind of landscape that swallows a person whole and asks no questions. Whatever her reasoning, she went, and she stayed. And it is worth pausing here on something the story itself never explains. Something that tends to settle strangely in the mind of anyone who follows this history closely enough. Many centuries later, a different figure, a boy who would grow into the darkest wizard of his age, would also choose Albania as the place to disappear into, the place to hide the ruined remains of himself when he had nowhere else left to go. No text ever draws a line between these two flights. No historian has ever offered a reason why the same quiet, forested country would call to 2 such different people across so many centuries, one fleeing her mother's love, the other fleeing the ruin of his own ambition. It may be nothing more than coincidence, the kind that history is full of. But it is the sort of echo that, once noticed, is difficult to stop hearing. In Albania, Helena built a small and hidden life. She told no one who she was. She kept the diadem close, sometimes wearing it, sometimes simply keeping it near her the way a person keeps a memory they are not ready to look at directly. And the years passed the way years do when a person has chosen to be forgotten. Word did not reach her, because she made certain it could not, and so she did not know, for a long while, what was happening back at the castle she had left behind. Her mother was dying. Rowena Ravenclaw's final illness came slowly, the way the histories describe it, and through all of it she asked for one thing above every other comfort offered to her. She asked for her daughter. Whatever anger Rowena may have carried in the days after the theft, it seems to have burned itself down to something softer as her strength failed, something closer to longing than to fury. And those who sat with her in her final weeks understood that she would not find peace without seeing Helena's face once more. But Rowena herself could not travel, and so she turned to the one person in her circle who loved her daughter enough, or perhaps wanted her daughter badly enough, to cross an unknown distance in search of her. He is remembered now only as the Bloody Baron, though in that era he was simply a nobleman, alive and breathing, moving through the same corridors as the founders themselves, and bound to Helena by a devotion she had never returned. He loved her by every telling that survives, and she did not love him back, and it was to this man, carrying both his own hope and Rowena's dying wish, that the dying woman turned. "Find her," she asked of him, "and bring her home, and let her know that whatever she has done can still be forgiven, if only she will come back before it is too late." And here the story arrives at something it has never fully resolved, something worth sitting with slowly rather than rushing past. What, exactly, was the nature of the Baron's love for Helena? The old accounts call it devotion, call it a great and burning affection, and it is tempting, in a story told at this hour, to imagine it simply as one heart aching quietly for another that could not ache back. But there is another reading that the same old accounts leave open, never closed, never denied. A love that cannot accept being unwanted is not always only love. Sometimes it is something closer to possession, a need to have and to hold that mistakes itself for tenderness, that dresses itself in the language of devotion while wanting, underneath, only to keep. No text tells us which of these the Baron carried in his chest as he set out after her. Perhaps even he did not fully know. He crossed the same distance Helena had crossed, through forests she had chosen precisely because they swallowed travelers whole, and somehow, after searching longer than most men would have had patience for, he found her. He found the small hidden corner of Albania where she had made her quiet life, the diadem still with her, still close, still unclaimed by anyone but her. He told her what her mother had asked him to tell her, that Rowena was dying, that she wanted only to see her daughter's face again, that forgiveness was waiting on the other side of the journey home if only Helena would take it. And Helena, standing in the place she had chosen precisely to be unreachable, said no. She would not go back, not with him, not for her mother, not for the diadem she still would not surrender. What passed between them in that moment, whether pleading or anger or something quieter and sadder than either, the histories do not preserve in detail, and perhaps it is better, at this hour, not to imagine it too vividly. What is known is only this, that the Baron had crossed a continent for an answer, and the answer he received was the one he had least wanted to hear, and that he did not leave her there. Not yet. Not in this part of the story. Up next, in Chapter 5, the Baron's unforgivable hour, we'll uncover, close your eyes, if you have not already, and let the last candle in the room burn low. Tonight, we return to a cold hillside in Albania, where the pine trees stand black against a sky the color of ash, and where a man who was once a nobleman of Slytherin House has finally found the girl he crossed a continent to find. Helena Ravenclaw stands before him now, no longer a rumor, no longer a shape glimpsed at the edge of a forest. She is real, and she is close enough to touch, and she has just told him, gently but without any hesitation, that she will not come home. The bloody Baron, though on this night he was not yet bloody and not yet a Baron of the dead, only a living man who loved a woman who did not love him back in the way he needed her to, feels something inside him give way. He had told himself, all through the long journey across the sea and through unfamiliar country, that finding her would be enough, that he only needed to see her safe, that he only needed to know she still breathed. But now that she stands in front of him, whole and alive and entirely unwilling to return, the wanting in him curdles into something else, something older than love and far less patient. We do not know, and no version of this story that has survived the centuries tells us exactly what passed between them in that final hour. We know only the shape of the ending, the way a burn scar tells you a flame was once there without ever showing you the fire itself. Helena Ravenclaw's mother, Rowena, had sent the Baron after her daughter with instructions to bring her home by whatever means necessary. Whatever means necessary. 4 words that, spoken in desperation by a dying woman to a man already half mad with longing, may have opened a door that should have stayed shut. The Baron, in his grief and his fury, raised his wand against her. A curse left him that should never have been spoken against someone he claimed to love. And Helena Ravenclaw, daughter of one of the 4 founders of Hogwarts, keeper of a stolen diadem, fell in that cold Albanian forest and did not rise again. Let that settle for a moment in the quiet of the room. This is the darkest hour in this whole long history of ghosts and legacies, and it deserves to be told slowly, without flinching and without rushing past it, because what happened next is just as important as what happened in that terrible instant. The Baron looked down at what he had done, and whatever fury had carried him across the sea and through the trees left him all at once, the way a wind can simply stop, leaving the branches trembling in a silence that feels louder than the storm ever did. He understood, in that moment, with total and unbearable clarity, that he had destroyed the one thing he had crossed the world to protect. There was no undoing it. There was no spell in his considerable knowledge, and he was, by every account, a formidably learned wizard that could call a soul back into a body once it had gone. So he turned the same violence upon himself. Some tellings say it was the same curse spoken back into his own chest. Other, older whispers passed down through Hogwarts folklore speak instead of a blade, a sword he carried and turned against himself in that same clearing, which is why, in certain versions of this story, chains are not the only thing said to follow him through the corridors of the castle. Whichever telling is true, and the canon itself has never chosen between them, the result was the same. He fell beside her, 2 bodies in a forest that had asked for neither of them. It would be comforting, perhaps, to imagine that such a shared and terrible ending might bind 2 souls together forever. That grief and guilt, being so entwined in that single night, would carry Helena and the Baron into whatever comes after as companions, even in death. But that is not what happened, and this is the mystery that has never once been resolved in 700 years of retelling. When the 2 of them eventually found their way, separately, back to the halls of Hogwarts, they did not arrive together. They did not even arrive as allies. Helena's spirit settled quietly into Ravenclaw Tower, the house of her mother, drifting through its blue and bronze corridors with a stillness that unsettled even the students who never learned her story. She became known, in time, as the Grey Lady, a ghost so private and so guarded that centuries would pass before she told anyone, even a boy on a desperate errand of his own, the truth of how she died. The Baron, meanwhile, did not go to Ravenclaw. He did not follow her, not in death any more than she had let him follow her in life. He became bound instead to Slytherin House, wearing chains that clank and drag through the dungeons to this day, chains he forged for himself, the stories say, as a penance no one ever asked him to serve. Silver bloodstains cover his ghostly robes, and he has carried that image, unchanged, through every single year that Hogwarts has stood since. And here is the question this whole chapter has been circling, the one no historian, no headmaster, no portrait on any office wall has ever fully answered. Why did they not stay together? Two souls joined by the same singular, unrepeatable night of violence, the same guilt, the same forest, the same silence afterward, and yet they walked into their deaths and into eternity in entirely opposite directions. Helena chose distance. She chose Ravenclaw, her mother's house, as though returning to the family she had once fled might undo, in some small way, the running that had cost her everything. And the Baron chose exile of a different kind, binding himself instead to the house that had produced him, alone, dragging the evidence of his crime through the dark for 1,000 years. For nearly a millennium now, by every account that survives, Helena Ravenclaw has continued to avoid him. Portraits mention it. Older ghosts mention it in the careful, sideways way that spirits speak of things they would rather not speak of at all. She does not linger in corridors when his chains can be heard approaching. She does not attend the same feasts, does not drift through the same walls, does not, so far as anyone living has ever recorded, exchange so much as a single word with him in all that time. An exile that, as far as we know, continues even now, in the same castle, under the same enchanted ceiling, 2 floors and 1 house apart. There is one more thread to this mystery worth pulling before we let the candle go out. The Bloody Baron is, by wide agreement among students and staff alike across the centuries, the only ghost at Hogwarts that other ghosts themselves seem to fear. Nearly Headless Nick, who has haunted Gryffindor Tower with a certain wounded dignity for 500 years, is known to step carefully around the subject of the Baron. Peeves the Poltergeist, who fears almost nothing and respects even less, obeys the Baron without argument, the only figure in the entire castle who can make him behave. And yet, no record, no letter, no diary entry ever fully explains why. His crime is known. His chains are visible to anyone with eyes. But whatever it is that makes even the dead uneasy around him has never been written down in full, and perhaps it never will be. Some say it is simply the weight of what he did that night in Albania, worn so openly and so permanently that it changes the air around him. Others suggest that something in that final hour, something in the manner of his own death, left him marked in a way ordinary grief does not. The truth, like so much of this story, has been left in the dark on purpose, or perhaps only through the slow forgetting that centuries bring to even the most terrible nights. Rest now, and let the forest and the chains and the 2 separate corridors fade quietly from your thoughts. Up next in Chapter 6, the chamber no one was meant to find will uncover a secret hidden not in a distant forest, but within the very stones of the castle itself. Rest now, and let the sorrow of Helena and the Baron settle like snow that has finally stopped falling. Their story ended in blood and silence centuries ago, and nothing can be undone in it now. But grief, in the world of Hogwarts, rarely stays in one corner of the castle. Beneath the floors where Helena once walked, beneath the very foundations the 4 founders raised together with such hope, another secret was already waiting. It had been waiting long before Helena ever fled her mother's tower, and it would go on waiting for nearly 1,000 years after the Baron's dagger fell still. Tonight, the lore turns toward that secret and toward the founder who built it. His name was Salazar Slytherin, and once he was not an enemy of Hogwarts. He was one of its makers. Alongside Godric Gryffindor, Helga Hufflepuff, and Rowena Ravenclaw, he helped raise a school meant to gather young witches and wizards from across Britain and teach them safely, at a time when magic itself was something to hide, something that could bring danger from those who feared it. The four founders were said to have been friends in those early years, bound by a shared belief that magical children deserved a place of their own, a castle set apart from the ordinary world, high on a hill, ringed by lake and forest, where they might learn without fear of the eyes that watched them beyond its walls. Slytherin was clever, ambitious, and, by every account that survives him, deeply proud of the pure magical line he came from. For a time, the four worked as one. Together they raised towers and carved corridors. Together, they divided the students who came to them into 4 houses, each shaped in the image of the founder who led it, each said to value the qualities that founder prized most. Slytherin's house came to be known for its ambition, its cunning, and its resourcefulness, and for many years, there was nothing especially dark in that reputation. He was simply one voice among 4, respected, if a little colder than the rest, a little more guarded about who he wished to see pass through the school's doors. That pride became the fracture that ended everything. As the years passed, the founders began to disagree, quietly at first, about who belonged within Hogwarts' walls. Gryffindor, Hufflepuff, and Ravenclaw wished to welcome any student who showed magical ability, regardless of the family they were born into. Slytherin did not. He believed that only those from magical families, wizarding blood carried down through generations, ought to be admitted, and that students born to non-magical parents brought a risk he was unwilling to accept. Historians who study this period agree that this argument grew over time, rather than erupting all at once. Though how long it simmered before the final break, no record has ever settled. What is certain is that it could not be resolved. Slytherin, outvoted and increasingly isolated from the 3 founders who had once been his closest companions, chose to leave the school he had helped build. He did not leave quietly. According to the stories passed down through centuries of students, and later confirmed in fragments by those with reason to know, Slytherin did not simply walk out through the front gates and vanish from history. Before his departure, in secret, he carved out a hidden chamber somewhere beneath the castle, far below the dungeons he himself had favored as his own domain. He sealed it with magic so old and so particular that, for many generations, even scholars of considerable skill could not say with certainty how it had been done. Inside that chamber, he placed a creature of extraordinary and terrible power, a basilisk, a serpent capable of killing with a single direct glance, capable of growing to a monstrous size over the span of centuries, sustained somehow within stone walls that saw no sunlight and offered no visible way in or out. Slytherin's intention, as the legend has always told it, was chillingly patient. He did not build the chamber to strike at once. He built it to wait. He meant it to remain hidden until a day, perhaps generations after his own death, when an heir of his own bloodline would walk the halls of Hogwarts, a descendant able to speak Parseltongue, the rare and serpentine language that only those of his line, and very few others in the wizarding world, have ever been known to command. That heir alone would be able to open the chamber, release the basilisk, and finish what Slytherin himself had never managed to finish: the purging of the school of those students he considered unworthy of a magical education. The very students the other 3 founders had insisted on welcoming. Imagine the scale of that patience. A creature sealed in darkness, coiled beneath a school full of children who never once suspected it was there, kept alive somehow, growing larger with each passing century, waiting not for days or months, but for a bloodline to survive, wander, marry, and multiply across generation after generation, until at last one descendant, born far from the castle and perhaps never even told the truth of where his ancestry led, might one day walk through the front doors as an ordinary student. It is a plan built entirely on patience and blood, and it is here that the story becomes, in the truest sense, an unsolved mystery. No record, however old, however carefully studied, has ever established exactly when Slytherin built this chamber in relation to his final departure from the school. Some accounts suggest he worked on it for years before the argument with his fellow founders ever reached its breaking point, laying the foundation of his revenge long before he admitted, even to himself, that he intended to leave. Others suggest the opposite, that the chamber was raised swiftly, almost in secret desperation, in the last months or even weeks before he walked away from Hogwarts for good. Neither version has ever been proven. The chamber offers no dates. The stone does not say when it was carved. Stranger still is the question of how he managed to hide it so completely. Gryffindor, Hufflepuff, and Ravenclaw were not ordinary witches and wizards. They were among the most gifted magical minds of their age, powerful enough that their names still anchor the four houses of the school 1,000 years later. And yet, not one of them, not in all the years they continued to walk those same halls, teach in those same towers, and shape the castle Slytherin had helped design, ever discovered what he had built beneath their feet. A basilisk sealed away, hidden entirely from three of the most formidable magical figures of their generation, for the rest of their natural lives. How magic of that era achieved such total concealment remains, even now, without a satisfying answer. And what became of Slytherin himself afterward is perhaps the quietest mystery of all. He left Hogwarts, and from that point, the historical trail essentially disappears. No account states plainly where he traveled, where he settled, or where, eventually, he died. He never returned to the school himself to open the chamber he had built, though nothing in the old accounts explains why not. Did he grow old somewhere far from the castle, waiting for a descendant who never came in his own lifetime? Did something prevent his return that history simply never recorded? The founder who shaped one of the most dangerous secrets in the wizarding world vanished from it just as completely as the chamber itself would remain vanished from view. For century after century after century, for very nearly 1,000 years, the Chamber of Secrets existed only as a story told and retold by students who mostly did not believe it. A rumor in common rooms, a warning half meant as a joke, a legend without proof. Then, in the 1940s, it was opened for the first time on record by a student who was, though almost no one at Hogwarts knew it yet, Slytherin's own true heir. A girl died that year inside the castle walls. And decades later, the chamber opened again, not through the heir's own living hand this time, but through the lingering, manipulated memory of that same young man, reaching forward across the years to finish what had waited so patiently to be finished. Up next, in Chapter 7, The Brother Who Went Alone, we'll uncover the chamber that Salazar Slytherin left sealed beneath the school was built on a belief. The belief that some blood was worth more than other blood. And that belief did not end with him. It traveled forward across the centuries, passed down through old families who kept it polished the way one keeps a family heirloom, displayed with pride, dusted often, never questioned. Few households carried that belief more fiercely than the Black family. and few members of that family carried it more faithfully, at least at first, than a quiet, dark-haired boy named Regulus Arcturus Black. His story begins in devotion and ends in a flooded cave far from anyone who loved him, and to this day, the family that raised him never learned the whole truth of what happened there. Regulus was the younger of two black brothers, born 2 years after his brother Sirius, into a household on Grimmauld Place that prized above almost everything else the purity of its lineage. The black family tapestry hung in that house like a kind of scripture, tracing a bloodline back for centuries, and any relative who married outside the old pure blood families, or who defied the family's values in some other way, was simply burned off the cloth, erased as though they had never existed. Sirius rebelled against all of it early and loudly, and was disowned for his trouble. Regulus did not rebel. He watched his brother's name vanish from the tapestry. He absorbed the lesson his parents meant for him to absorb. And he grew into exactly the kind of son the black family had hoped for, proud of his ancestry, sorted into Slytherin, and drawn, as so many young men of his background were during those years, toward the rising figure who promised to restore pure blood families to what he called their rightful place. By the time Regulus was 16, Lord Voldemort's movement was gathering real power in the wizarding world, and by the time Regulus turned 18, he had joined it, becoming a Death Eater while barely more than a boy. It is worth pausing on that fact for a moment, because it says something quiet and sad about how ordinary the beginning of this story is. He was not a monster from birth. He was a teenager who wanted his parents' approval, who had been raised inside a house that treated cruelty toward those of lesser blood as a kind of family virtue, and who mistook a murderer's promises for a noble cause. Thousands of young wizards made smaller versions of the same mistake during those years. Regulus simply made his in a house grand enough, and a bloodline old enough, that his choice would end up mattering more than most. What came next is where the official record grows thin, and where this mystery truly begins. At some point, Regulus learned, or came to suspect, a piece of information that very few people outside Voldemort's innermost circle possessed, that the Dark Lord had gone to extraordinary and unnatural lengths to protect himself from death, splitting his own soul and hiding fragments of it inside ordinary objects, a practice so dark that it was barely spoken of even among dedicated followers of the dark arts. One of those hidden fragments, a locket that had once belonged to Salazar Slytherin himself, passed down through generations until it reached the Gaunt family and finally into Voldemort's hands, had been placed for safekeeping inside a sea cave along a remote stretch of coastline, guarded by black water and by a small boat that would only carry one thin passenger at a time. How Regulus came to know all of this has never been fully settled, and probably never will be, because the person most likely to have witnessed the turning point was not a wizard at all, but a house elf. Kreacher had served the Black family faithfully for decades, and it seems that Voldemort himself, needing to test the cave's defenses before trusting them with something so precious, borrowed Kreacher for that very purpose. Using the elf as an unwilling rehearsal for the theft that Regulus himself would later attempt, Kreacher was made to drink from a stone basin filled with a potion that inflicted upon anyone who swallowed it a terrible, consuming thirst alongside visions of the very worst memories buried in that person's mind. Memories designed to break the will and invite the drinker toward the black lake below, where the drowned dead were said to wait, pale hands ready to pull the weakened swimmer under. When the potion had done its work, Voldemort did not trouble himself to bring the elf home again. He left Kreacher there, alone, in the dark, expecting him never to return. Yet elf magic allowed Kreacher to make his own way back to Grimmauld Place, broken, half mad with what he had seen. And it was Regulus, of all the household, who sat with him and listened to what had happened in that cave. No letter, no diary, no surviving witness has ever recorded the exact moment when Regulus's loyalty broke. It is one of the quietest and most complete turns in the entire history of the war, precisely because it happened somewhere private, inside the mind of a 19-year-old boy listening to his family's oldest and most trusted servant describe being used and discarded like a piece of equipment. Perhaps it was simple loyalty to Creature himself. Perhaps it was the first crack in a belief system Regulus had never truly examined before that night. Whatever the reason, Regulus made a decision that he shared with almost no one, and that decision would cost him his life. He asked Creature to take him to the cave, and there, understanding by then exactly what waited inside that stone basin, Regulus did something that his master never would have predicted from him. He ordered Creature to swap the true locket for a fake one once the potion had been drained and the way was clear, and to leave immediately afterward, carrying the real Horcrux far from that place, no matter what happened to Regulus himself. Creature begged to stay. Regulus refused to allow it. And then, alone, with no one else present to see it, no one to record it, no one to help him, Regulus lifted the basin's terrible potion to his own lips and began to drink, cup after cup, feeling the thirst and the visions take hold exactly as they had taken hold of Creature weeks before. When the basin was finally empty and the locket lay exposed at the bottom, Creature did as he had been ordered. He took the real Horcrux and vanished from that cave, leaving his young master behind on the edge of that black water. What happened after that has never been witnessed by anyone who survived to tell it. The lake's drowned inhabitants, drawn by the disturbance, are believed to have pulled Regulus under, weakened as he was by thirst and by whatever horrors the potion had shown him, and he is presumed to have died there, alone, in the dark, without a single member of his family ever learning where or how. For years afterward, all the Black family knew was that Regulus had disappeared, and that whispers placed his death sometime around his own resistance to Voldemort's orders. A resistance the family understood only as disgrace, never as sacrifice. While Burga Black mourned a son she believed had failed his master, not one who had defied him, the wider wizarding world, consumed by war and then by uneasy peace, never learned his name at all. It was only years later, when a locket bearing a hidden, hastily written message came into the hands of Harry Potter himself, that anyone outside that house understood what Regulus Arcturus Black had actually done, alone, in a cave, at the age of 18. By then, the boy who left that message was long past hearing what it meant to anyone. Rest now, and let that quiet act of courage settle over you the way dark water settles once it has finally gone still. Up next, in Chapter 8, The Curse with No Named Inventor, we'll uncover the strange, unsettling history of the killing curse itself, the darkest of all forbidden magic, and the puzzling truth that no record in the wizarding world has ever named the wizard who first created it. There is a particular kind of quiet that settles over a story once a sacrifice has been made, and it was in that quiet that Regulus Black's final choice was left to rest, alone in the dark of a cave beneath the sea, a locket clutched to his chest, and no one left alive to carry his name forward with any kindness. He went where he went, and did what he did, and the world above never knew until long afterward, if it ever fully knew at all. But grief and courage were not the only forces moving through that story. Somewhere behind every death that has ever touched the wizarding world, gentle or violent, expected or sudden, there sits one particular piece of magic more feared than any other. A magic so absolute that it does not wound, does not weaken, does not give a body time to suffer or a healer time to intervene. It simply ends. And of all the shadows this world has ever cast, few are stranger or older or less understood than the one behind this curse itself. It is called, in every text that dares to name it at all, the Killing Curse, or by its older incantation, Avada Kedavra. It is spoken of among the 3 unforgivable curses, set apart from every other piece of dark magic, by the severity of the law that governs it, and by the simple, terrible fact that nothing about it can be undone. There is no counter-curse. There is no healer's draught, no potion steeped through the night, no spell murmured over a still body that can call a life back once that curse has found it. It leaves no mark at all, no wound, no bruise, nothing for a mediwitch to examine or a coroner to explain. A person struck by it simply stops, the way a candle stops burning when the wick has nothing left to give. Except that with this curse, the wick is cut whole and entire in an instant, with no flicker beforehand and no smoke after. Against most other dangers in the wizarding world, there exists at least the possibility of defense. A shield charm can turn aside many spells, a well-timed dodge, a conjured wall, a lucky duck behind old stone. These things have saved countless witches and wizards from curses that might otherwise have ended them. But the Killing Curse cannot be blocked by any shield charm ever recorded, and this alone sets it apart from nearly everything else taught or studied in the whole of magical education. The only defenses ever documented are physical objects placed directly in its path, sturdy enough to be destroyed in the victim's place, or a magic so old, so rare, and so powerful that it operates on rules altogether different from ordinary spellcraft, the kind of magic that asks nothing of wand work or incantation at all, and everything of love freely given. That single exception is where this mystery begins to deepen, because it did happen once in a nursery in Godric's Hollow on a night already heavy with loss. A curse was cast, fully and without hesitation, at a child barely old enough to stand on his own, and for reasons that have never been fully unraveled by even the wisest minds the wizarding world has ever produced. That child lived. Lily Potter had died only moments before, refusing again and again to step aside, and it was said afterward, by those who studied the matter for years without ever quite closing the question, that her death in that doorway had wrapped her son in something the curse itself could not pass through. Not a shield, not a ward, something older than either, drawn from the simple, complete act of a mother giving herself in her child's place. The curse rebounded instead, and Harry Potter carried only a thin scar shaped like lightning, a mark that should not, by any known law of that magic, have been possible to survive at all. And here is where even the wisest among them found themselves at the edge of their own understanding. Albus Dumbledore, who studied this event more closely, and for longer than perhaps any other wizard alive, never claimed to fully explain it. He spoke of the protection in careful, searching language, calling it an old magic, a magic that Voldemort himself had never valued, and so had never understood. But he stopped short, again and again, of saying precisely how a mother's death could turn aside a curse that had never once failed against anyone before her. It remained, even to him, something closer to a mystery honored than a mystery solved. No textbook has ever reduced it to a formula. No spell has ever been built to replicate it on command. It happened once, under circumstances that can never quite be gathered again, and it has never happened in quite that way since. But beneath even that unresolved wonder lies an older, quieter question, one that reaches further back than that single night in Godric's Hollow. And it is simply this. No record anywhere in the wizarding world, names the witch or wizard who first created the killing curse. There is no inventor remembered, no origin story taught in any classroom, no old family credited with having first shaped those two words into something capable of ending a life outright. Spells of great power are usually remembered by name, tied to a witch or wizard whose skill or ambition or desperation gave the world something new. But this curse, arguably the most feared piece of magic in the entire wizarding world, arrived into history already fully formed, already understood, already so dangerous that the Ministry of Magic eventually chose to place it under the strictest possible law. And even that choice carries its own quiet puzzle. The Ministry did not simply forbid the curse the way it forbids countless other dangerous or restricted spells through ordinary statute and penalty. It named the killing curse unforgivable, one of only 3 spells ever given that particular designation, a category set apart from the whole of magical law, as though ordinary prohibition was somehow not enough to answer what this curse truly was. No surviving record explains why that higher and stranger classification was chosen, rather than simply banning the spell outright, as one might ban any other forbidden piece of magic. Perhaps stranger still is the way the curse behaves in the hands of different casters, a detail that hints at something far deeper than mere incantation. A skilled witch or wizard, filled with genuine and complete intention to kill, can bring the curse to its full and instant effect. But it is well recorded that the same words, spoken by someone without that true intention, someone reciting the incantation out of duty, or fear, or a desperate attempt to imitate what they have seen, will produce almost nothing at all, a faint effect at best, nowhere near the absolute and silent finality the curse is known for. This single fact suggests that whatever this magic truly is, it is not merely a formula of sound and wand work, the way so many other spells are. It seems to reach towards something within the caster themselves, something that may be tied to intention in a way ordinary spellcraft never asks for. And some who have studied it quietly wonder whether it draws on something as deep and as personal as the caster's own soul. No text has ever confirmed this. No one has ever proven it. It remains, like so much of this curse's history, a shape glimpsed only at the edges, never fully brought into the light. So the questions rest together, unanswered and unhurried, the way old questions often do when the people who might have answered them are long since gone. Who first spoke those words into being, and in what forgotten age? Why the Ministry chose to set this curse above all others, worthy of its own singular, unforgivable class? Why intention itself seems to matter more than incantation, as though the curse listens not to the wand, but to the will behind it? And why, on one single night, in one single doorway, it failed for the only time anyone has ever recorded. Against a mother's love it could not pass through, and could never fully explain. Let it rest now, unsolved, the way it has rested for as long as anyone has studied it, and let yourself rest along with it. Up next in Chapter 9, the man who split his soul first will uncover the quiet, terrible moment when a boy first tore his own soul in two, and the price that choice would carry for every year that followed. Settle back into the dark, and let the last chapter's question drift away unanswered, because that is where it must stay. No one has ever found the name of the wizard who first spoke the curse that ends with a flash of green light and a body that falls and does not rise. That silence, that absence of an inventor, is unsettling enough on its own. But there is an older darkness still, one that predates even that curse by a very long stretch of centuries, and it belongs to a single man whose name has survived the ages far better than almost anything else about him has. His name was Herpo, and history remembers him by the title his own contemporaries gave him, Herpo the Foul. He lived in ancient Greece, in a time so distant that most of what might once have been known about him, his family, his teachers, the shape of his ordinary days, has simply dissolved into the centuries the way ink dissolves in water left standing too long. What remains is not a biography. It is closer to a warning, passed from teacher to student, from old and careful books to the next generation of wizards who were never meant to open certain pages too eagerly. It was Horace Slughorn, in a memory that was later drawn out and examined with such difficulty and such reluctance, who first spoke the name aloud in the telling that matters most to us. He explained, to a curious student many centuries after Herpo had died, that this ancient Greek wizard was the first person in recorded wizarding history to split his own soul and seal a piece of it inside an object outside his body. He was the first to make what is now called a Horcrux, not a legend of one, not a rumor of one, the first known instance in the entire written record of the wizarding world. Think, for a moment, about what that actually means. Every other dark witch or wizard who has ever attempted this magic, in every century since, has had something to work from. A whispered account. A forbidden book with a chapter they were told never to read past. A single sentence buried in a restricted volume, warning them just enough to tell them the horror was possible, even while refusing to explain exactly how. Herpo the Foul had none of that. There was no one before him. There was no warning written down anywhere in the world, because no one had ever done this before him, for a warning to be written about. Whatever process he used to tear his own soul and press a fragment of it into some object apart from his body, he found it alone, in the dark, with no map and no one to tell him he had gone too far until it was already done. That is the shape of the mystery this chapter carries, and it is worth sitting with for a while before we go any further. Somewhere in ancient Greece, a man who wanted to escape death more than he feared what escaping it might cost him, worked out, entirely by himself, the single most dangerous piece of magic that would ever be discovered in the long history of witches and wizards. Books that dare to even mention the process, centuries later, still open with warnings not to attempt it. Warnings so severe that most wizarding libraries keep such texts locked away from ordinary readers. And yet, somehow, long before those warnings existed, before there was anyone left living who could have told him not to, Herpo did it anyway, and he did it first. No record explains how he found his way there. No diary, no letter, no fragment of parchment survives to tell us whether it took him years of failed attempts, or whether some terrible flash of understanding came to him all at once, the way certain kinds of knowledge sometimes do, arriving less like a discovery and more like something that had always been waiting to be found by the first person, reckless enough to go looking. We simply do not know, and in all likelihood, we never will. There is one more thread woven into Herpo's story, and it belongs less to the solemn history of dark magic and more to the older, stranger folklore that wizards have long passed down about him. It is said, in tellings kept alive across generations long before Hogwarts itself was founded, that Herpo the Foul was also the very first wizard to breed and hatch a basilisk. The method, as the old folklore tells it, was as strange as anything else attached to his name. He is said to have taken a chicken's egg and had it hatched beneath a toad, coaxing into existence, through that odd and unnatural pairing, the first of the giant serpents whose gaze alone could kill. It is a small, almost folkloric detail sitting right beside the gravest discovery in the history of dark magic, and yet it fits him. A man willing to go first into the splitting of a soul was perhaps exactly the kind of man willing to go first into hatching a monster no one had ever seen before. That detail matters for more than just its strangeness, because it reaches forward through the centuries in a way few pieces of ancient history do. Salazar Slytherin, founder of Hogwarts and keeper of a secret chamber built to house a creature of his own choosing, is understood to have relied on Herpo's method, passed down through the long chain of dark and careful knowledge that connects one generation of dangerous wizards to the next. The basilisk that would eventually sleep beneath the castle for nearly 1,000 years. The same creature that would one day be woken in a girl's bathroom and set loose through the pipes of Hogwarts, traces its origin, at least in the old telling, back to a single man in ancient Greece, who decided, apparently on his own initiative, that the world needed its first serpent capable of killing with a glance. But it is the other discovery, the splitting of the soul, that leaves the deeper and more troubling question hanging in the quiet air of this chapter. Because history, for all its records and all its careful accounting of famous witches and wizards, tells us almost nothing about what became of Herpo after he made his Horcrux. We do not know where he lived out the remainder of his days. We do not know how he died, or whether the word death even applies cleanly to a man who had already torn a piece of his own soul free and hidden it somewhere far from his body, precisely so that death would have less of him to take. We do not know what object he chose to hold that fragment of himself. We do not know where it was placed, or whether it was ever found, examined, or destroyed by anyone in the many centuries that followed. And that is the thought worth carrying with you as the candle burns lower tonight. A Horcrux, once made and never destroyed, does not fade with time the way memory does, the way names on old gravestones slowly wear smooth under centuries of rain. It simply waits. If no wizard in all the long stretch of history between ancient Greece and the present day ever found the object Herpo chose, and no one ever performed the terrible work required to destroy it, then there is nothing in the old texts that tells us it could not still be sitting somewhere in the world tonight, forgotten, unremarkable to look at, holding within it the same small, still fragment of a man who has been dead for thousands of years. A piece of the very first person ever to attempt this magic, quietly persisting, unnoticed, in some corner of the world that has long since stopped remembering his name. Modern wizarding scholars who study the earliest history of dark magic tend to treat Herpo less as a fully remembered person and more as an origin point, a name attached to the beginning of a thread that stretches forward across thousands of years to Tom Riddle, who studied those very same old careful books and asked Horace Slughorn the very same forbidden questions Herpo himself must once have asked someone, somewhere, with no teacher left alive today to say who that might have been. It is a strange kind of immortality to be remembered only as the first, with everything else about the life that made that first possible worn away by time until almost nothing recognizably human remains of him at all. Let that settle, slow and heavy, the way the best and strangest mysteries always do. And let your thoughts drift now towards sleep. Up next in Chapter 10, the historian who knew too much will uncover a scholar who came dangerously close to understanding more about this same dark magic than anyone was ever meant to survive knowing. Settle back down now, and let the memory of Herpo the Foul fade the way old parchment fades, curling at the edges until the ink is only a suggestion of itself. We leave behind the ancient dark of the first soul ever split, and we travel forward across many centuries to a small stone cottage on a quiet lane in a village called Godric's Hollow, where a much gentler kind of darkness was waiting, patient and mostly unnoticed, for nearly 100 years. The woman who lived in that cottage was named Bathilda Bagshot, and for most of her long life she was known to the wizarding world as something rather comforting: a historian. An author, the mind behind a history of magic, the very textbook that generations of Hogwarts students, drowsy in their first-year classrooms, opened without ever imagining that its author lived only a short walk from the ruins of a house where the most important event of the entire war had once taken place. Bathilda wrote of goblin rebellions and international statutes and the slow, careful architecture of wizarding law. She wrote, in other words, about everything except the one subject she alone was fully qualified to explain. Because Bathilda Bagshot was not simply a historian who happened to live in Godric's Hollow, she was a witness. A witness to something so quiet and so ordinary at the time that nobody, least of all Bathilda herself, could have known it would one day matter more than any goblin rebellion ever had. She had been, for many years already, a close and trusted friend of the Dumbledore family, the sort of neighbor who was invited in for tea without needing an invitation. So when tragedy struck that family, when Kendra Dumbledore died and left her son Albus suddenly responsible for a fragile household, it was Bathilda who remained close, who offered what comfort an old friend could offer a young man carrying more grief and more secrets than anyone around him understood. And then, that same summer, Bathilda's own great-nephew came to stay with her. A brilliant, restless boy from the Durmstrang Institute, expelled for reasons the school preferred not to advertise, sent across the sea to live under his elderly aunt's roof, while whatever trouble he had caused at home was allowed to cool. His name was Gellert Grindelwald. Sit with that for a moment, because this is the heart of what makes Bathilda Bagshot so unlike any other figure in this whole long history. For one single summer, in one small village, she was the only person alive who stood close enough to see both boys clearly. She watched Albus Dumbledore, brilliant and grieving and quietly furious, at a life that had trapped him at home instead of letting him take the future everyone had promised him. And she watched Gellert Grindelwald, equally brilliant, equally restless, arriving with ideas about wizarding power that would eventually cost thousands of lives. She was there when the two young men found each other. She may well have been the one who introduced them, two remarkable minds discovering, over her own tea table perhaps, that they shared a hunger neither had found anywhere else. She watched a friendship catch fire between them that summer, one that would, within a matter of weeks, curdle into tragedy when Albus's own sister Ariana died during a duel between the three young men, a death whose exact hand was never named, not by Albus, not by his brother Aberforth, not by history itself. Bathilda Bagshot watched all of it happen. And then, for the rest of her natural life, she said almost nothing about it at all. Decades passed. Bathilda grew old the way historians often do, gently, surrounded by books, her reputation as a scholar only deepening with time, her personal knowledge of the century's most consequential friendship kept folded away somewhere no reader of her tidy, careful textbooks would ever suspect. She corresponded, in her later years, with the wider wizarding world only rarely. But there was one correspondence she did keep, in the last stretch of her life, with a journalist named Rita Skeeter, who was assembling a scandalous, unauthorized biography of Albus Dumbledore not long after his death. What Bathilda told Rita Skeeter, in letters and in conversation, changed everything the public thought it knew. She revealed the friendship with Grindelwald. She revealed the summer in Godric's Hollow, the shared ideals of wizarding dominance the two young men had once written to each other about. Ideas that would have horrified the wise old headmaster the world believed it knew. Details nobody else alive could have supplied, because nobody else alive had been standing close enough to see them happen. Which leaves us with a question this chapter cannot fully answer, because nobody ever has. Why did Bathilda Bagshot, a woman who spent her entire career writing history, who understood better than almost anyone the value of an honest record, choose to say nothing publicly for the better part of 70 years. Why hand her knowledge only at the very end? And only to a journalist known more for cruelty than for care, rather than ever setting it down herself, in her own steady scholarly hand, while she still had the clarity to shape how it would be understood. Was it loyalty, an old friend's quiet decision to let a grieving young man's worst summer stay buried? Was it something closer to fear of Grindelwald, or of what the truth might do to a family she had loved? We are never told, and by the time anyone thought to ask her directly, it was already too late for a clear answer. Because by then, Bathilda Bagshot was a very old woman indeed, living alone in that same cottage, her memory softened by age into something that came and went like weather. Neighbors in Godric's Hollow had grown used to seeing her shuffle along the lane, murmuring to herself, sometimes forgetting where she was going before she arrived there. She had become, by the last winter of her life, a fragile and forgetful shadow of the sharp historian she had once been. And it was in that condition, alone and unguarded, that she was found by Lord Voldemort himself. He came to Godric's Hollow, searching for information about the Deathly Hallows, the 3 legendary objects said to grant their possessor mastery over death, and he knew, from Rita Skeeter's book, that Bathilda Bagshot might hold pieces of that answer. Fragments of what she had once understood about a wand and a stone and a cloak, about a history far older and far stranger than anything she had ever put in a textbook. What exactly passed between Voldemort and the elderly historian in that final visit? How long, he questioned her. How long he waited or watched before anyone else arrived has never once been established. We know only what came after. Voldemort killed her. And then, in one of the coldest acts of patience in this entire dark history, he did not simply leave her body behind. He concealed his enormous serpent, Nagini, inside it, folding the great snake into the frail, lifeless shell of a woman who had once poured tea for a young Albus Dumbledore, and he left that terrible disguise waiting in the dark, a trap built entirely out of grief and memory, for whichever seeker might one day come looking for answers in Godric's Hollow. That seeker, months later, was Harry Potter, who arrived at the cottage believing he had found a frail old woman who might finally help him understand the symbol he had seen everywhere, the same one Bathilda had once tried to explain, however imperfectly, to Rita Skeeter years before. He followed what he thought was Bathilda Bagshot up her own creaking staircase, into a house full of old photographs of Dumbledore as a boy, never once suspecting what waited inside that borrowed, silent body until it was very nearly too late. So the mystery of Bathilda Bagshot closes without ever fully opening. We do not know how long Voldemort held her before Harry arrived, whether it was hours or days or longer still. We do not know exactly what she understood about the Deathly Hallows, only that she understood something, some fragment large enough to be worth killing for and worth waiting for. And we do not know, and likely never will, why a woman who held the truest, earliest secret of the entire war folded so quietly into her books instead, saying nothing for 70 long years, until it was almost too late to say anything at all. Let her rest now, the historian who knew too much and told almost none of it, her cottage standing quiet again in Godric's Hollow, its photographs gathering dust in rooms nobody visits anymore. Up next in Chapter 11, the boy who broke the registry will uncover a much younger secret, one hidden not in old letters or old friendships, but in a single stolen name that helped one final battle begin. There is another kind of danger in the wizarding world that has nothing to do with curses or hidden chambers, and everything to do with laws written by frightened people about a condition they never bothered to understand. Lycanthropy, the affliction of the werewolf, has existed in magical Britain for as long as anyone can trace, and for nearly all of that time, the wizards who suffered from it were treated less as sick people and more as monsters who had simply not yet been caught doing something monstrous. The Ministry of Magic, at various points in its history, drafted registries meant to track every known werewolf in the country, restricting where they could work, whom they could marry, and in the darkest periods, whether they could hold a wand license at all. The reasoning offered was always the safety of the public, and there is truth folded somewhere inside that reasoning, because a werewolf who does not take precautions during the full moon is, for those few hours, capable of terrible harm without any memory of having caused it. But the laws rarely distinguished between a person who spent every full moon locked safely away, harming no one, and a person who did not, and so an entire class of witches and wizards found themselves unemployable, unwelcome, and quietly erased from ordinary life the moment their condition became known. Remus Lupin lived this exact erasure for most of his adult years. Bitten as a small child by the werewolf Fenrir Greyback, an attack his father Lyle may have provoked by speaking carelessly about werewolves deserving no sympathy, Remus grew up carrying a secret so dangerous that even his acceptance to Hogwarts nearly did not happen. Albus Dumbledore made the arrangements himself, having the Whomping Willow planted to conceal a passage to a shrieking, reinforced house in the village below, so that Remus could transform each month without endangering the school. He was given an education few werewolves of his era ever received, and for a while, surrounded by 3 loyal friends who chose to become unregistered animagi rather than abandon him during his transformations, he had something close to an ordinary youth. But Hogwarts was the exception, not the rule, and once he left its walls, the registry and the prejudice that came with it followed him everywhere. He lost job after job the moment employers discovered what he was, not because he had ever harmed anyone, but because the law itself treated his condition as a permanent, unforgivable liability. Fenrir Greyback, by contrast, embraced the very reputation Remus spent his life trying to escape. Where the law saw all werewolves as one undifferentiated threat, Greyback made himself into precisely that threat, deliberately biting children in order to raise them as isolated, embittered creatures with nowhere else to turn but toward him, and, eventually, toward Voldemort's cause. He treated his affliction not as a private grief to be managed quietly, but as a weapon, and the Ministry's blunt, fearful policies toward all werewolves gave him exactly what he needed: a population of outcasts with every reasonable door already closed to them, and very few reasons left to trust the world that had shut those doors. The unresolved question sitting at the center of this whole history is an uncomfortable one, and it has never been answered cleanly by the wizarding world itself. Did the registry and its restrictions exist to protect ordinary witches and wizards from genuine danger? Or did those very laws help manufacture the danger they claimed to prevent? By pushing gentle, frightened people like Remus toward isolation, while handing men like Greyback a ready population to recruit from. No official inquiry within the wizarding world ever seriously asked this question, and no reform came quickly enough to change the shape of Remus Lupin's life. He married Nymphadora Tonks late, almost apologetically, worried that his condition made him unfit to be a husband or a father, worried enough that he nearly left her rather than risk passing his affliction to a child. He fought in both wars against Voldemort, taught briefly and brilliantly at Hogwarts, until parents, informed of his condition by a colleague with a grudge, forced his resignation despite an unblemished record of care and competence. He died in the Battle of Hogwarts beside his wife, having spent decades of his short life apologizing for something that was done to him as a small boy walking home in the dark. The mystery here is not a single vanished object or a single unsolved crime. It is quieter and larger than that. A whole category of people, judged collectively for the actions of the worst among them, and a system that never once paused to ask whether its own fear was doing more harm than the thing it feared. The ministry's own textbooks made little effort to soften this judgment. Standard classifications of magical creatures placed werewolves among the most dangerous beings a witch or wizard might encounter, a rating that made no distinction between a person mid-transformation and a person going quietly about an ordinary Tuesday. And school policy across most of magical Britain simply barred known werewolves from enrolling at all, on the reasoning that no safeguard could be trusted completely. Remus Lupin's own acceptance at Hogwarts, arranged personally and quietly by Dumbledore, was treated for years afterward as an exception granted through influence rather than a standard any other student might reasonably expect, and the fact that his 7 years there passed without incident, thanks entirely to the secrecy his 3 friends helped maintain, was never held up publicly as evidence that the wider policy might be wrong. If anything, the case remained hidden precisely because revealing it would have forced uncomfortable questions the ministry had no appetite to answer. Decades later, during a period when fear of Voldemort's return made the wizarding government more punitive rather than less, new legislation tightened restrictions on werewolves even further, making it harder still for someone like Lupin to find steady work no matter how careful or blameless his conduct remained. The timing of this tightening, arriving precisely when Voldemort's forces were actively working to recruit embittered, excluded werewolves to their cause, has never been satisfactorily explained by any surviving ministry record, and no official ever seemed to connect the two facts publicly: that the harder the law pressed down on ordinary werewolves, the more willing men like Fenrir Greyback found new recruits waiting for him, already pushed to the margins by the very system meant to keep everyone safe. Nymphadora Tonks faced her own quiet version of this same prejudice simply for choosing to love Remus and marry him, disowned in spirit, if not entirely in name, by relatives who found the match shameful, a small, private echo of the much larger fear and disdain the wider wizarding world directed at werewolves as a category rather than as individual people capable of gentleness, restraint, and love. Exactly as Remus himself proved to be for the whole of his difficult, careful life. Up next in Chapter 12, the servant who chose the winning side will uncover the strange, unsettled question of what truly drove Peter Pettigrew to betray the friends who trusted him with everything, and whether cowardice alone can explain a choice that cost so many lives. Cowardice is easy to name and hard to fully explain, and nowhere in the whole long history of the wizarding world is that harder than in the case of Peter Pettigrew. He was the fourth of the 4 boys who called themselves the Marauders, the quieter one, the one who trailed slightly behind James Potter and Sirius Black in cleverness and daring, and who seemed, for years, simply grateful to be included in a friendship far more dazzling than anything he might have built alone. When the first war against Voldemort darkened Britain, Peter was among the friends James and Lily Potter trusted with their lives, and when the time came to hide behind the Fidelius charm, it was Peter, not the obvious choice of Sirius, who was named Secret Keeper, precisely because no one would think to suspect the unremarkable one. That single piece of misdirection became the hinge on which an entire war turned. Peter had, by then, already gone to Voldemort in secret, offering the location of his friends in exchange for his own survival, and whether that decision was made from long simmering fear, quiet resentment at always being the least among his friends, or simple self-preservation in the face of a war he believed the Potters were destined to lose. The wizarding world never received a clear answer, because Peter himself never gave one honestly. After the betrayal, he did something almost no one expected of a man thought too timid for real cunning. He faked his own death in a crowded street, screaming an accusation at Sirius Black before detonating a curse that killed 12 muggles and blew off his own finger, then transformed into his rat animagus form and vanished into the sewers, leaving Sirius to be arrested and imprisoned for a crime he never committed without trial for 12 years. For over a decade, Peter lived as a pet rat named Scabbers in the household of the Weasley family, close enough to Harry Potter's world to watch it from the safety of a cage, close enough to know exactly what was happening to the son of the friends he had helped murder. And he said nothing, did nothing, simply endured the discomfort of being near the boy, while never once attempting to make amends. When his cover finally broke during Harry's 3rd year, Peter begged for his life with the same trembling desperation he had likely used to justify his original betrayal, invoking his old friendship with James as though loyalty could be summoned only when it was convenient for his own survival. Harry, remarkably, stopped Sirius and Lupin from killing him on the spot, not out of forgiveness, but out of a reluctance to let his father's friends become murderers on his account. An act of mercy that would later prove to have enormous, unintended consequences. Peter went on to serve Voldemort directly during his years of exile, sacrificing his own hand in the resurrection ritual that restored his master's body, earning in exchange a new silver hand that obeyed Voldemort's will more than his own. The wizarding world has never settled the deeper question underneath all of this, whether Peter Pettigrew was simply a coward who happened to be present at a series of historic events, or whether there was something colder and more calculating in him all along. A man who read the direction the war was turning and placed his loyalty exactly where it would keep him alive, regardless of who paid the price. His end came in a manner many found strangely fitting, and others found strangely unresolved. The silver hand Voldemort gave him, enchanted to punish any hesitation or mercy, closed around his own throat the moment he hesitated to kill Harry Potter, choking him to death in a cellar, his final act an unintended echo of the one small mercy Harry had shown him years before. Whether that was justice, coincidence, or something closer to fate, no one has ever agreed. Those who knew Peter Pettigrew during his school years have offered fragments that hint the seeds of his choice were planted long before any war forced his hand. Even as a teenager, he was remembered as someone who gravitated instinctively toward whoever held the most power in a room. Quick to laugh at the right moment, quick to agree. A small and constant recalibration of loyalty that most of his friends mistook for simple admiration rather than the early shape of something more self-serving. Sirius Black, looking back on those years after his own escape from Azkaban, described Peter as always needing someone stronger to follow, a trait that seemed harmless enough among schoolboys and proved catastrophic once the stakes became a war rather than a friendship. The 12 years Peter spent disguised as the Weasley family's pet rat deserve their own quiet consideration, because they represent an extraordinary act of sustained deception, carried out not for some grand purpose, but simply to remain unnoticed. He lived in a house full of children, was handled and fed, and occasionally nearly discovered, most notably when the family cat Crookshanks took an immediate and persistent interest in him that Peter could never fully explain away. And through all of it, he offered nothing, warned no one, and did not so much as flinch when he later watched, from the safety of his disguise, the early signs of the very war he had helped ignite beginning to stir again around a boy who did not know he was living beside his parents' betrayer. There is a particular cruelty in how long Sirius Black paid for a crime that was, in truth, Peter's alone. 12 years in Azkaban. 12 years of a reputation as the man who betrayed James and Lily Potter. 12 years during which Peter lived comfortably, if quietly, within arm's reach of the family he had helped destroy, never once stepping forward to correct a lie that cost his old friend so completely. When the truth finally surfaced, it did so, almost by accident, through a chain of small coincidences rather than any deliberate reckoning. And even then, Peter escaped before anyone could bring him to any formal justice, fleeing back into hiding and, soon after, back into Voldemort's service, as though the intervening years of comfortable disguise had taught him nothing beyond how to vanish a second time when circumstances required it. Up next in Chapter 13, the prison built on an island of despair will uncover the strange, undocumented origins of Azkaban itself, and the question of who first decided that despair should be a punishment administered by creatures rather than people. Far out in the cold water north of Britain, on an island so isolated that most wizards will never see it and would not survive long if they did, stands Azkaban, the prison of the wizarding world, and almost nothing about its true beginnings has ever been written down with any certainty. Every witch and wizard knows what Azkaban is, a place of gray stone and endless corridors, guarded not by wands or locks but by dementors, creatures who feed on hope and happiness until a prisoner is left with nothing inside but the worst memories they possess, replayed without end. What almost no one can say with confidence is who first decided this particular island. And this particular method of punishment was the answer to the question of what a wizarding society should do with its most dangerous criminals. The name Azkaban itself is old, older than most surviving ministry records, and the fortress is generally understood to have been built by a dark wizard named Ekrisdus sometime in the 13th century. A man who was said to lure Muggle sailors to the island to torture and kill them using dark magic, and who inadvertently drew the Dementors to the place through the sheer volume of suffering and despair he created there. When the Ministry of Magic eventually seized the island, the official story holds that they judged the fortress, already saturated with centuries of anguish and already home to creatures that thrived on exactly that anguish, to be more useful as a prison than worth demolishing. But this account leaves enormous gaps that no historian of the wizarding world has ever fully closed. No one has ever explained why the Ministry chose to keep the Dementors rather than remove them, when it was known even then that Dementors could not be controlled, only tolerated, and that they would drain guilt and innocence with equal indifference. No formal debate over this decision survives in any known record. No dissenting voice preserved. No explanation of why an entire government agreed to imprison its citizens beside creatures capable of destroying a person's mind entirely. A punishment far beyond whatever sentence a judge had actually handed down. The human cost of that decision is easier to trace than its origins. Sirius Black spent 12 years there for a crime he never committed, and by the time he escaped, those around him barely recognized the gaunt, hollow figure he had become. A man who had survived only by clinging to his innocence as the one true thought the Dementors could not fully erase. Bellatrix Lestrange, imprisoned for over a decade for her crimes against the Longbottoms, emerged instead hardened, seemingly untouched by the despair that broke others, a fact the wizarding world has never adequately explained beyond guessing that her devotion to Voldemort gave her something to hold on to that Sirius's stolen years did not. The uneven way the prison affected different minds, breaking some completely and leaving others intact, has never been studied or explained by any known text, and the Ministry itself never seemed particularly interested in asking why, treating the prison's brutal effectiveness as sufficient justification on its own. By the end of the Second Wizarding War, the Ministry finally removed the Dementors from Azkaban's service, a decision made not from any reckoning with the morality of the system, but from the plain, practical fact that the creatures had defected to Voldemort's side entirely, no longer answering to anyone but him. It is worth sitting with how long that took. For centuries, an entire government relied on creatures it could not truly command, guarding people through a method it never fully understood, on an island whose original purpose had been cruelty for its own sake. And no single record explains why no one, across all those generations of ministers and administrators, thought to ask whether there might have been a better way. Beyond ordinary imprisonment, the Ministry also sanctioned a punishment more severe than any sentence a court could formally hand down: the Dementor's Kiss, in which a Dementor removes a person's soul entirely, leaving the body alive but permanently emptied of everything that made it a person. Unlike a standard trial and sentencing, the kiss was in certain periods authorized to be carried out immediately upon capture, without the accused ever standing before a court at all, a practice most starkly illustrated by the fate nearly forced upon Sirius Black at the end of his third year. When officials arrived prepared to administer the kiss, the moment they believed they had their man, based on evidence that later proved entirely wrong. No record explains clearly who first decided that soul removal, an act with no known method of reversal, should ever be available as a punishment carried out without full judicial process, and no formal review of how many such kisses may have been given in error has ever been made public. Even the guards who worked among the Dementors were not immune to their effects, and several accounts from Ministry employees stationed on the island describe a slow, creeping despair that settled over anyone who spent long stretches near the fortress, guards included, a cost the Ministry seemed to treat as an unfortunate but acceptable expense of running the prison, rather than a sign that something in the system itself needed to change. Transport to and from the island carried its own quiet dread, since prisoners were typically moved by boat across icy water, patrolled by the very creatures waiting on shore, a journey many survivors later described as worse in its anticipation than almost anything that followed. The cold and the growing silence, a kind of preview of the despair to come. Escape from Azkaban was considered, for centuries, essentially impossible, a belief so deeply held across the wizarding world that Sirius Black's eventual escape, achieved by transforming into his animagus dog form and slipping through the bars of his cell, was treated less as evidence the prison had a flaw and more as a singular, almost unrepeatable event, never prompting a wider review of the fortress's actual security. Up next, in Chapter 14, The Mirror That Should Not Exist, we'll uncover the strange, unexplained magic of a mirror that shows not the truth, but the deepest and most dangerous longing of whoever stands before it. Tucked away in an unused room at Hogwarts, framed in ornate gold and standing taller than a grown man, is a mirror that should not, by any ordinary understanding of magic, be able to do what it does. The Mirror of Erist does not show a reflection at all in the way any other mirror would. It shows the deepest, most desperate desire of whoever stands before it, rendered so vividly and so convincingly that a person can lose themselves in it entirely, forgetting to eat, forgetting to sleep, forgetting that the figures moving inside the glass are not real, and never will be. Albus Dumbledore, who kept the mirror and understood its danger better than almost anyone, once told a young Harry Potter that men had wasted away in front of it, driven mad by a happiness they could see perfectly but never touch, and moved the mirror repeatedly from place to place, across the years specifically, to keep any one person from finding it twice. What almost no record explains is how such a mirror could be made at all. Ordinary magical objects, however powerful, tend to have some traceable function rooted in known branches of magic. Charms that alter appearance, transfiguration that changes form, potions that affect the body in predictable ways. The Mirror of Aristide does something categorically stranger. It appears to reach directly into the desire of a specific person standing in front of it, a desire that is by definition unique to them and unknowable to anyone else in advance, and to construct, instantly and flawlessly, a visual scene tailored to that exact longing. No wand work of that precision has ever been documented elsewhere in the historical record. No known enchantment allows an object to read the deepest wish of a mind it has never encountered before, and answer it correctly every single time, for every single person, without fail. The inscription carved across the top of the frame, when read correctly, translates roughly to a riddle, stating that the mirror shows not the viewer's face, but the viewer's heart's desire, confirming what the mirror does without explaining how it manages to do it. No maker's name survives attached to the mirror. No workshop, no era of construction. No earlier mention in any older text has ever been found describing where it came from or who first discovered how to build such a thing. It appears in the historical record already finished, already ancient, already dangerous, as though it had simply always existed in the collection of magical curiosities the wizarding world quietly stopped asking questions about. Harry Potter first encountered the mirror as an 11-year-old boy and saw his parents standing beside him, alive and smiling, a vision so overwhelming that he returned to it night after night, despite Dumbledore's gentle warnings, risking exactly the kind of wasting hunger the headmaster had described in others. It was Dumbledore himself who eventually used the mirror's strange power for something more precise than simple longing, arranging its enchantment so that only someone who wanted to find the Sorcerer's Stone and not use it would be able to retrieve it from the glass, a use of the mirror so specific and so deliberately engineered that it suggests Dumbledore understood far more about its inner workings than he ever wrote down or explained to anyone else. Whatever knowledge he possessed about how the mirror could be made to do that died with him, leaving behind an object still capable of showing any person their most private longing. Its true origin as unreachable to us now as it apparently was even to those who used it. There is a quieter mystery folded inside this one, rarely raised, because so few people ever had the standing to ask it directly of Dumbledore himself what the mirror would have shown him. He deflected the question when Harry once asked, offering only a gentle, half-joking answer about a pair of warm socks. A response so plainly evasive that it reveals more by what it conceals than what it states. Coming from a man who had already lost a sister to tragedy, a friendship to betrayal, and decades of his life to quiet, private grief. Whatever true longing lived behind that deflection was never recorded anywhere, and Dumbledore died without ever answering the question honestly, leaving even the one person who understood the mirror's danger most completely as another small, unresolved absence in its long history. The deeper unease the mirror raises has less to do with magic and more to do with desire itself, and with how little the wizarding world seems to have grappled with the ethical weight of an object capable of showing anyone, instantly and perfectly, the exact shape of what they want most and cannot have. No law governs its use. No department oversees its safekeeping beyond whatever precautions a single headmaster chose to take on his own initiative. It sits wherever it is placed, waiting for the next person who happens to find it, offering the same beautiful, dangerous gift to saint and fool alike, with no instructions attached beyond the warning of a headmaster who understood exactly how easily a person could lose themselves inside it. Consider, too, how easily the mirror could be misused by someone less careful than Dumbledore, or less protected by his particular kind of quiet self-discipline. A person consumed by grief could stand before it and see a lost loved one restored, indistinguishable from life in every visible way, and might reasonably choose to remain there indefinitely rather than return to a world where that loss is real and permanent. A person hungry for power could see themselves already victorious, already ruling, and might mistake that vision for a plan rather than a temptation. The mirror offers no warning of its own danger, no built-in caution, only the image itself, endlessly patient, waiting for whoever happens to stand close enough to see it. Up next in Chapter 15, The Wizard Who Was Never Punished, we'll uncover the long, quiet decades Gellert Grindelwald spent free in the world after his darkest crimes, and the question of why no one stopped him sooner. Long before Voldemort ever rose to power, the wizarding world had already lived through one dark wizard's war, and the man at the center of it, Gellert Grindelwald, was free to pursue his ambitions for far longer than most people realize. As a young man, brilliant and dangerously charismatic, he was expelled from Durmstrang for experiments so twisted even that school, known for tolerating darker magic than most, could not permit them to continue. Rather than face any lasting consequence, he simply traveled to England to stay with his great-aunt, Bathilda Bagshot, in Godric's Hollow, where he met and befriended the teenage Albus Dumbledore, the two of them spending a summer dreaming up a vision of wizards ruling openly over muggles, justified always by the phrase "for the greater good." That summer ended in the accidental death of Dumbledore's sister, Ariana, and Grindelwald fled England that same night, escaping before anyone could question him properly about what role he had played in her death. What followed was not a swift reckoning, but a long, mostly unimpeded rise. Grindelwald spent years building support across mainland Europe, amassing followers, developing dark magic, and eventually starting a war that would claim countless lives, all while the wizarding governments of the time responded slowly, cautiously, and in most documented cases, far too late. He was never captured through some brilliant act of pursuit or justice. He was defeated in 1945 by Albus Dumbledore himself, in a duel so significant it became known simply as the Duel of the Century, and only then, after decades of violence, was he finally imprisoned. In the highest cell of Nurmengard, a fortress he had built himself, ironically, to hold his own enemies. The mystery that sits underneath this entire history is one the wizarding world has never comfortably examined. Why did it take so long? Dumbledore, arguably the only wizard alive capable of matching Grindelwald in power, avoided confronting him directly for years. And the official explanation, that Dumbledore feared what might be revealed about Ariana's death if the two of them ever fought, is only ever offered as personal reluctance, never as an adequate justification for the cost of that delay measured in other people's lives. Meanwhile, magical governments across Europe treated Grindelwald's growing movement as a problem to be managed rather than a threat to be stopped, exchanging warnings and committee reports while his influence spread largely unchecked. No official inquiry after the war ever seriously asked why the world's most capable wizard chose personal avoidance over public safety for as long as he did. And no institution ever fully reckoned with how many of Grindelwald's victims might have been spared had that duel happened years earlier. Even Grindelwald's imprisonment carries its own quiet, unresolved thread. He spent his final years alone at the top of Nurmengard, and near the very end of his life, when Voldemort came seeking the truth about the Elder Wand's location, Grindelwald refused to give it to him. A small, strange act of resistance from a man who had spent his life pursuing exactly the kind of domination Voldemort now represented. Whether that refusal came from genuine remorse, from some flicker of the old affection he once held for Dumbledore, or simply from a stubborn wizard's final refusal to be useful to anyone, is something no historian of the wizarding world has ever been able to say with certainty. He died shortly after, killed by Voldemort in that same lonely cell, taking whatever true reason for his final defiance had been with him. Part of Grindelwald's early power came from a wand he acquired under circumstances that were, at the time, treated as a minor scandal, rather than the warning sign it should have been. He obtained the Elder Wand, the most powerful of the 3 Deathly Hallows, from the celebrated wand-maker Grigorovich. Either stealing it outright or acquiring it through means Grigorovich himself later described only reluctantly, and used its power to devastating effect throughout his rise, long before Dumbledore ever took it from him in their final duel. That Grigorovich survived the encounter at all, and lived long enough to later be hunted down and questioned by Voldemort about the wand's whereabouts, is itself a detail that received far less scrutiny at the time than it likely deserved. Just as unexamined is the question of what became of the many followers who had supported Grindelwald's cause for years before his defeat. Unlike the Death Eaters, who would later stand trial in significant numbers after Voldemort's first fall, no comparable wave of prosecutions followed Grindelwald's imprisonment, and most historians of the era simply note that his movement dissolved quietly once its leader was gone, without ever explaining where those followers went, what became of their beliefs, or whether any of them simply waited, undisturbed, for another dark wizard to eventually take up a similar banner. The scar Grindelwald left on the wizarding world's memory is strange in its unevenness. His name is known and feared across magical Europe, invoked as a byword for the kind of ideology that later found its darker echo in Voldemort's own rise. And yet, the details of his war, its battles, its victims, its full scale, remain far less documented and far less taught than the war that came after it, as though one generation's trauma is always destined to be overshadowed by the next. Students at Hogwarts in Harry Potter's own time learned only the barest outline of Grindelwald's rise. A single duel and a single defeat standing in for years of a war that, at the time, felt just as endless and just as frightening to those who lived through it as Voldemort's war would later feel to their children. Up next, in Chapter 16, The Veil That Answers to No One will uncover the strange stone archway hidden deep within the Ministry of Magic, and the mystery of what truly waits on the other side of its softly whispering curtain. Deep within the Ministry of Magic, in a circular stone chamber, inside the Department of Mysteries, known as the Death Chamber, stands a raised stone dais, and at its center, an ancient stone archway, holding within its frame a torn, tattered veil that moves gently, as though stirred by a wind no one else in the room can feel. Those who spend time near it report hearing faint whispers and murmuring voices drifting from behind the fabric, voices that seem, to some listeners, almost familiar. No one who has ever passed through that veil has come back to explain what lies on the other side, and the unspeakables who study it in secret have never published a single confirmed answer about what it actually is. The one attempt at understanding it recorded in the wider wizarding world is not scientific, but personal and devastating. During the battle at the Department of Mysteries, Sirius Black, struck by a curse from his cousin Bellatrix Lestrange, staggered backward and fell through the veil, and simply vanished, his body gone as though the archway had taken him rather than killed him in any way that left a trace. Harry Potter, watching, ran toward the dais, convinced Sirius could somehow be pulled back out, and had to be physically restrained by Remus Lupin, who told him, with a certainty that suggested long, painful familiarity with the Death Chamber's reputation that there was no possible way back through that veil. No body was recovered. No spell has ever retrieved anything that passed beyond it. Whatever the veil is, it does not return what it takes. The ministry itself has never released an official account of the veil's origin or nature, and this silence is itself part of the mystery. Because the Department of Mysteries is precisely the branch of magical government built to study exactly this kind of phenomenon, and its researchers, called unspeakables, are bound by an oath of secrecy so complete that even their own families rarely know what they study. Whatever theories exist about the veil, whether it is a boundary between life and death itself, a doorway to some other realm entirely, or something stranger still that resists even those categories, remain locked inside a department that has never once, in any known record, chosen to share its findings with the wider wizarding public. The whispering voices heard near the archway have never been identified as belonging to anyone in particular, and no one has ever explained why only some visitors hear them clearly, while others hear nothing at all. What makes the Death Chamber different from every other unsolved mystery in this history is that it may simply be unsolvable by design, not through any failure of investigation, but because whatever lies beyond the veil may not be the kind of thing magic, however powerful, was ever meant to fully explain. Every other mystery in this telling involves people, witnesses who stayed silent, records that were lost, decisions no one wrote down clearly enough. The veil offers no witnesses at all, only an old stone frame, a soft and constant movement in fabric that should not move, and the quiet, terrible certainty that whatever steps through it does not come back to describe what it found. It is worth setting the veil beside the one other documented brush with death the wizarding world has any real account of, because the contrast is instructive. When Harry Potter was struck by Voldemort's killing curse in the forest outside Hogwarts, he experienced something that felt to him like a station between worlds, a place of soft light where he could speak with Dumbledore and choose, in the end, to return. That experience, however strange, was at least described afterward, discussed, turned over, and puzzled through by the person who lived it. The veil offers nothing of the kind. No one who has passed through it has ever come back to say whether what waits there resembles that same gentle station, or something else entirely, or nothing at all. And the difference between an experience that can be described and one that simply erases the person having it is in its own way the most unsettling fact about the Death Chamber. Other rooms within the Department of Mysteries carry similar unexplained weight. Chambers devoted to time, to thought, to love, each apparently studied by unspeakables whose findings never leave the building, but none carry quite the same finality as the Death Chamber, because time can be misused and thought can be examined, while whatever lies beyond that veil has never once permitted itself to be examined at all. Those who fought in the battle around the Death Chamber that day rarely speak of it afterward, and the few accounts that exist describe the room itself as unsettling even before anything happened within it. A circular space built around a single dropping pit toward the dice. Tiered stone benches rising on all sides like an amphitheater constructed for an audience that never seems to be present. Whether the room's design came before the veil or was built specifically to contain and observe it is, like so much else about the chamber, something the Department of Mysteries has never chosen to explain to anyone outside its own locked doors. There is also the matter of who is permitted to know the Death Chamber exists at all. Ordinary witches and wizards, even highly trained ones, rarely have any reason to set foot in the Department of Mysteries in the course of an entire career, and the veil's existence lives mostly as rumor and second-hand story among the wider wizarding public, something spoken of in hushed, uncertain tones rather than studied openly the way other dangers, however serious, tend to be. This quiet containment of knowledge may be deliberate caution on the ministry's part, a recognition that public fascination with a doorway between life and death could cause exactly the kind of desperate, dangerous curiosity that took Sirius Black's own godson running toward the dais that night. Or it may simply be one more example of a government more comfortable locking difficult truths away than explaining them honestly to the people it governs. Up next, in Chapter 17, the shopkeeper who simply vanished will uncover the quiet disappearance of a beloved Diagon Alley shopkeeper during the height of Voldemort's second rise to power, and the question of what became of him that was never truly answered. Not every mystery in this history involves famous names or turning points in a great war. Some are smaller and in their own way more unsettling, precisely because of how ordinary they are. Florian Fortescue ran an ice cream parlor on Diagon Alley for years, a warm, generous presence known to generations of Hogwarts students, including a young Harry Potter, to whom he once gave free sundaes and long, patient conversations about famous medieval witch burnings and other odd corners of wizarding history, treating a curious boy's questions as worth real answers rather than a nuisance to be waved away. He was, by every account that survives of him, a kind and unremarkable man, the sort of person a community barely notices until he is gone. During the height of Voldemort's second rise to power, in the summer before Harry's 6th year, Florian Fortescue simply disappeared. His shop was found abandoned, signs of a struggle left behind, and no explanation was ever offered to the public about what had happened to him or why. The wizarding world, gripped at the time by a wave of similar disappearances and murders as Voldemort's forces tightened their hold on magical Britain, absorbed the news of his vanishing much the way it absorbed so many other losses that summer, with fear and grief, but without any real expectation that answers would follow. None ever did, not officially. Rita Skeeter later suggested in print that he had been murdered or forced into hiding by Death Eaters, likely as punishment for some perceived defiance, or simply as a demonstration of what the new regime was capable of doing to anyone, however harmless. But this was speculation from a journalist, known for stretching facts, not a confirmed account from any authority with real knowledge of the case. No body was ever recovered. No trial followed. No Death Eater was ever charged specifically with his disappearance. And no ministry record, even after the war ended and many other crimes were finally investigated and prosecuted, ever closed the file on what became of Florian Fortescue. He is, in the fullest sense, one of the disappeared, a person the war swallowed without leaving behind the smallest trace of explanation, and his story stands in for a much larger, quieter tragedy that the official histories of the war rarely dwell on. The ordinary people, the shopkeepers and neighbors and kind strangers who gave a lonely boy free ice cream, who vanished during those years without ever becoming a named chapter in anyone's account of the war, remembered mostly by the small, specific kindnesses they happened to show someone who later became famous enough to remember them back. There is a particular kind of sorrow in a mystery like this one, different from the sorrow of a diadem lost for centuries or a curse with no recorded inventor. Those mysteries are old enough to feel like history, softened by distance. Florian Fortescue's disappearance happened within living memory, to a man whose only crime, as far as anyone has ever been able to determine, may have been nothing more than kindness itself, offered too generously in a world that had grown dangerous for exactly that kind of openness. No resolution ever came, and none, at this point, ever likely will. His disappearance sits alongside another vanishing from that same dark summer, one that eventually, unlike his, found a resolution. The wandmaker Garrick Ollivander also disappeared around the same period, and for a long time his fate seemed destined for the same permanent silence as Florian Fortescue's. Only much later was it revealed that Ollivander had been captured and held prisoner by Voldemort himself, kept alive specifically for his knowledge of wand lore, particularly the mysteries surrounding the Elder Wand, and eventually rescued during the war's final year, thin and shaken, but alive. That one case found an answer only sharpens the absence of one for the other, and raises a question no historian has ever comfortably sat with. How many of the era's quiet disappearances might have had similarly survivable explanations, had anyone been in a position to search for them? And how many, like Florian Fortescue's, simply never will? The wizarding world's own accounting of the war's cost tends to focus on its named victims, the families and duels and battles that made it into later histories, and pays far less attention to the smaller, scattered absences that never resolved into a story anyone could tell completely. A shopkeeper who gave a lonely boy free Sundays belongs, in the end, to that quieter and far larger category of loss. Diagon Alley itself changed noticeably during those months. Shopfronts boarded or abandoned as their owners fled, disappeared, or simply stopped opening for reasons no one dared ask about too loudly. And the warm, familiar street Harry had once wandered as an 11-year-old boy discovering the wizarding world for the first time grew quieter and more frightened with each passing week. Florian Fortescue's shuttered parlor became, for a time, just one more empty storefront among many. Its owner's name rarely spoken aloud again, once the initial shock of his disappearance faded into the long, grinding fear that defined that entire year. Harry Potter himself seemed to carry the memory of that kindness longer than most people carry small childhood encounters, returning to it in his own mind years later, a testament to how much a single generous adult can mean to a boy who otherwise grew up starved of that kind of easy warmth. That Harry never learned any more about what became of Florian Fortescue than the rest of the wizarding world did is its own small, private sorrow layered on top of a much larger public one. A reminder that even a boy who eventually helped end the war could not undo every loss it caused along the way. Up next in Chapter 18, the father who judged his own son will uncover the quiet, devastating story of a ministry official who chose the law over his own family, and the secret that unraveled everything he had sacrificed to protect. Barty Crouch Sr. was, for most of his career, one of the most feared and respected figures in the Ministry of Magic, a man whose uncompromising stance against dark wizards made him a serious candidate for Minister for Magic himself. During the First War against Voldemort, he authorized methods that blurred the line between justice and cruelty, permitting Aurors to use the unforgivable curses against suspected Death Eaters and sending prisoners to Azkaban without full trials. A hard, unyielding approach that won him public support even as it cost him something quieter and more personal. His own son, Barty Crouch Jr., was arrested and convicted of torturing the Longbottoms into madness alongside Bellatrix Lestrange and Crouch Sr. True to the principles he had built his entire career upon, sentenced his own son to Azkaban without visible hesitation, a decision that made him appear, to the wizarding public, as a man whose devotion to law and order outweighed even his love for his family. What almost no one outside his household knew was that this appearance of unbending resolve was not entirely true. Crouch Sr.'s wife, dying and desperate to save what remained of their family, used Polyjuice Potion to switch places with their son inside Azkaban, smuggling him out under the disguise of his dying mother, while she herself remained behind and died in the cell meant for him. Her death recorded publicly as his, Crouch Sr. kept his son hidden at home for years afterward, controlled entirely through the imperious curse, a secret so dangerous that discovery would have ended his career and likely his freedom. And yet, he chose to keep that secret rather than either free his son publicly or turn him back over to Azkaban, as the law he had built his reputation on would have demanded. The unresolved question at the center of this story is not what happened, since the facts eventually came to light, but why Crouch Sr. made the choices he did at each stage, choices that seemed to contradict each other so completely. The man who sent his own son to prison without apparent hesitation is the same man who later broke the law repeatedly and secretly to keep that son hidden and controlled rather than accept what the law demanded a second time. No explanation he ever gave, publicly or privately, reconciled these two versions of himself, the ruthless enforcer and the father unable to fully let go. His control over his son eventually failed during the Triwizard Tournament, when Barty Jr., aided by House Elf Winky, escaped his father's grip long enough to orchestrate Voldemort's return to power using Polyjuice Potion to impersonate Aleister Moody for nearly an entire school year. Crouch Sr.'s end came alone and in disgrace, his mind unraveling under the strain of the secret he had carried for so long, escaping his son's control just long enough to try to warn Dumbledore and Harry Potter of what was happening, before being killed by his own son on the edge of the Forbidden Forest. His body was transfigured into a bone and buried in freshly dug earth by Barty Jr., hidden so completely that even in death, the truth of what had happened to him took time to surface. The wizarding world remembers him mostly as a footnote to Voldemort's return, a cautionary tale about secrecy and control, but the deeper mystery, the one never fully answered even by those closest to him, is which version of Barty Crouch was the true one. The man who believed utterly in the law, or the man who broke it again and again for the son that law had already condemned. The household elf Winky bore a heavy share of the consequences for secrets that were never truly hers to keep. Ordered by Crouch Sr. to watch over his hidden son and control him with the imperious curse whenever necessary, Winky was blamed publicly the one time Barty Jr. briefly slipped free during the Quidditch World Cup and was dismissed from service in disgrace by a master unwilling to admit what she had actually been protecting. She spent the remainder of that year devastated by the shame of her dismissal, drinking butterbeer to numb her grief in the Hogwarts kitchens, never once revealing the truth that would have cleared her name. Out of a loyalty to the Crouch family that none of them, by that point, had done anything to earn. No posthumous inquiry was ever opened into Barty Crouch Sr.'s conduct after his death. Despite the scale of what eventually came to light, a prisoner never lawfully released, a wife who died in his place with the ministry's own records never corrected, and years of an unforgivable curse used inside his own home without any oversight at all. The ministry, still reeling from Voldemort's confirmed return and the political embarrassment of having employed an impostor as a senior Auror for most of a school year, seemed content to let Crouch's story end with his death in the forest, another casualty of the war, rather than a case demanding its own separate reckoning. It is worth remembering, too, that Barty Crouch Sr.'s downfall unfolded almost entirely out of public view until its final, fatal night. Meaning, the wizarding world at large spent years admiring a man for a firmness of principle that, behind closed doors, he was quietly violating in the most serious way imaginable. The gap between his public reputation and his private conduct raises an uncomfortable question that extends well beyond his own case. How many other officials, praised for their unwavering commitment to law and order, might be managing similarly desperate exceptions to that same law within their own homes, hidden simply because no house elf or dying wife ever brought the truth into the light. The Crouch family's home life, glimpsed only briefly by outsiders across those hidden years, seems to have been a quiet, sealed-off world of its own. A father and a controlled, silenced son moving through the same rooms under a secret so total that even close colleagues at the ministry never suspected a thing was wrong. Winky's later devastation and her continued loyalty to a family that had used and then discarded her stands as one more small casualty tucked inside a much larger tragedy. A reminder that the cost of Barty Crouch Sr.'s divided loyalties fell hardest not on him, but on those with the least power to refuse what he asked of them. Up next in Chapter 19, The House That Chose to Forget, we'll uncover the strange, shifting nature of the Room of Requirement and the centuries of secrets it has kept simply because no one ever thought to ask it to remember them. Somewhere on the 7th floor of Hogwarts, behind a stretch of blank wall opposite a tapestry of a troll attempting to teach ballet, lies a room that does not exist until someone needs it to. The Room of Requirement, sometimes called the come-and-go room by generations of students who half understood what they were dealing with, transforms itself into whatever the person pacing 3 times before its hidden door most urgently requires. A hiding place, a training hall, a bathroom, or, in its largest and strangest form, an enormous chamber piled floor to ceiling with centuries of objects that other students across 1,000 years of Hogwarts history chose to hide there and never came back for. This last form of the room, known to those who found it as the Room of Hidden Things, is where the true mystery lies. No record survives explaining exactly how the room came to accumulate so much, or why it seems to remember every object ever concealed within it, while somehow forgetting nothing at all, stacking centuries of contraband, forbidden experiments, and abandoned secrets into towering, teetering piles that no single student or teacher has ever fully cataloged. Tom Riddle himself discovered this hidden capacity and used it to conceal Ravenclaw's diadem, one of his Horcruxes, trusting correctly that a room capable of swallowing 1,000 years of forgotten objects would swallow his secret just as completely. And he was right. The diadem sat there, undisturbed and unnoticed, for decades, passed by countless students who had no idea what rested only a few feet from where they hid their own smaller, more ordinary secrets. What the wizarding world has never satisfactorily explained is what kind of magic allows a room to hold memory this way, responding not to a spoken spell, but to need itself. Need so specific and so individually tailored that 2 people pacing outside its door at the same moment, wanting different things, will find entirely different rooms waiting for them on the other side. Most enchanted spaces in the magical world respond to fixed triggers, a password, a wand movement, a specific object. The Room of Requirement responds to something far less definable, an internal, unspoken want, and translates that want into physical space with a precision no other known magic in the wizarding world can match. No founder of Hogwarts is ever credited by name with its creation, and no text describes its construction the way other magical features of the castle, like the moving staircases or the enchanted ceiling of the Great Hall, are at least partially explained. During the Battle of Hogwarts, the room's final and perhaps most telling secret revealed itself when Vincent Crabbe, using a spell he barely understood, summoned fiendfire inside the Room of Hidden Things, a curse so ferocious it grew beyond anyone's control and very nearly destroyed the room and everyone inside it, consuming centuries of accumulated secrets in a single, uncontrollable blaze. It is worth pausing on what was lost that day. Objects hidden across 1,000 years of Hogwarts history, secrets belonging to students long dead, entire small mysteries of their own that no one will ever now be able to solve. All of it burned away in minutes because a single desperate boy needed a weapon, and the room, faithful to its nature, gave him exactly that. The room of requirement does not judge what is asked of it. It simply provides, and in doing so, it has quietly kept and then quietly erased more of the castle's true history than any single wizard alive will ever fully know. The room's smaller, gentler uses across the years leave their own faint trail of unrecorded history. A battered old textbook once annotated by a student calling himself only the Half-Blood Prince sat forgotten among the room's forbidden things for years before Harry Potter happened to claim it. Its true author's identity, another secret the room had quietly kept far longer than anyone intended. A cabinet capable of linking Hogwarts to a shop in Borgin and Berks was mended in near total secrecy within those same walls, allowing Death Eaters to slip into the castle during its final, darkest year. A plan that succeeded largely because no one thought to look for what the room might be hiding this time. Students across generations used it as a hideaway for far smaller, far less consequential secrets too. Ordinary adolescent troubles that mattered enormously to the students living them and left no trace at all afterward, absorbed into the same vast, patient silence that swallowed everything else. No headmaster or headmistress of Hogwarts has ever claimed full understanding of the room's true extent, and no complete inventory of what it has held across all its centuries of quiet service has ever been attempted, let alone finished. It remains, even now, one of the castle's least understood spaces, powerful precisely because it asks no questions of anyone who finds it and offers no explanation of itself in return. Even the room's method of appearing carries an unresolved oddity worth sitting with. It requires a person to walk past the same stretch of wall 3 times while holding their need clearly in mind. A ritual so simple it could easily be dismissed as decoration rather than mechanism. And yet no simpler method has ever been found to work, and no more complicated one has ever proven necessary. Whoever first discovered this exact, oddly specific requirement left no explanation behind. Only the pattern itself, passed down through generations of students by word of mouth, rather than any written record the castle itself preserves. Teachers at Hogwarts, across generations, seem to have known of the room's existence in only the vaguest terms, treating it more as schoolyard legend passed between students than as a documented feature of the castle worth including in any official history. Even Albus Dumbledore, who understood more about Hogwarts than perhaps any headmaster before him, admitted he had never fully mapped the room's capabilities, a rare and telling gap in the knowledge of a man rarely caught without an answer. Up next in Chapter 20, The Grave the World Forgot to Ask About, we'll uncover the oldest and quietest resting place in this whole long history, tucked into a small churchyard that most of the wizarding world walks past without ever knowing what it holds. In the small churchyard beside St. Jerome's Church in Godric's Hollow, among headstones softened by moss and centuries of rain, stands a grave marked simply with the name Ignatus Peverell, and beneath it, carved so plainly that most passers-by would never think twice about it, the mark of the Deathly Hallows, a triangle drawn around a circle, split by a single vertical line. Harry Potter walked past this grave on a cold Christmas Eve, searching for his parents' resting place nearby, and did not yet understand what he was looking at. A stone marking the final resting place of the youngest of the 3 Peverell brothers, the one who lived out his life quietly and peacefully under his cloak of invisibility, untouched by the greed that destroyed his brothers, and whose descendants would eventually become the Potter family itself. Not far from that same headstone lies another grave that draws far more visitors, that of James and Lily Potter, and it is a strange and quiet coincidence of history that these 2 resting places, one almost entirely overlooked, and one visited by pilgrims from across the wizarding world, share the same small patch of ground, bound together by a family line and a set of ancient objects that neither of them, in life, could have known would connect them so completely across the centuries. No record explains why Ignotus chose to settle and die in Godric's Hollow specifically, centuries before the village became known for anything to do with the Potters or with Voldemort's downfall, and no historian has ever traced the full line connecting his quiet grave to the events that would one day unfold only a short walk away, in a small house where a curse would rebound off a sleeping child and change the shape of the wizarding world entirely. The village itself holds this same quality of quiet, layered mystery. It is old, older than most of the stories told about it, home to generations of witches and wizards whose full histories were never recorded. Its churchyard filled with names that mean nothing to most visitors and everything to those who know how to read them, and its role in Harry Potter's own story is only the most recent chapter in a much older, much less examined history that the wizarding world has largely chosen not to ask about. Godric's Hollow itself seems to specialize in this kind of layered, unexamined history. It is named, most believe, for Godric Gryffindor, one of the 4 founders of Hogwarts, though even that connection rests more on tradition than on any document that definitively proves he lived there or founded the village himself. Long before the Potters ever chose it as a hiding place, and long before Bathilda Bagshot made it her home, the village had already quietly gathered its share of notable magical residents and unremarked graves, a place where history seems to settle and accumulate rather than announce itself, content to let visitors walk past its oldest secrets without ever noticing they were there. The war that eventually made the village famous, the curse that rebounded in a small house on a cold October night, is in many ways only the most recent and most visible layer laid over a place that had already been quietly keeping its own older stories for centuries before that night ever happened. Villages like this one exist all across magical Britain, quiet places that have absorbed centuries of ordinary and extraordinary history alike without ever demanding recognition for either, and it is only ever chance, some later war or some later child grown famous, that pulls one of them briefly into the light before the world's attention moves elsewhere again and the village returns to its older, slower rhythm of simply enduring. This is, in the end, the quiet thread that runs beneath every mystery gathered here tonight. A girl died in a silent house, and no one ever knew whose hand truly cast the curse. A diadem vanished for 1,000 years before a killer found it. A ghost and a fallen nobleman split into separate houses and avoided each other in death for as long as they had once avoided the truth in life. A brother went alone into a cave and died without anyone knowing his name had changed. A curse was given to the world with no one ever claiming to have made it. A soul was split for the first time by a man history barely remembers at all. A historian who knew everything said almost nothing before the silence was made permanent for her. A registry punished the innocent alongside the guilty and helped create exactly the danger it claimed to prevent. A servant chose survival over loyalty and was, in the end, undone by the one mercy he never deserved. An island held despair as policy for centuries before anyone thought to question it. A mirror shows a heart's truest want, and no one alive can say how it was built to do so. A brilliant, dangerous man walked free far longer than he should have, and even his final act of defiance went unexplained. A veil takes and does not return, and the department built to study it has never once chosen to share what, if anything, it has learned. A kind man vanished from his own shop, and the file on his disappearance was never closed. A father sentenced his son to prison and then broke every law he had built his life on to hide that same son at home. A room remembers everything it is given and forgets nothing until the day it burns. And beneath all of it, quietly, in a small churchyard, in a small village, a grave older than any of these stories, marked with a symbol most people who pass it will never learn to recognize, belonging to a man who simply wanted, more than anything else, to live quietly and be left alone by history. Perhaps that, more than any solved mystery ever could, is its own kind of answer, a lesson worth carrying quietly with you long after these particular stories have faded from memory and blurred together the way all bedtime stories eventually do. There is a comfort available in unresolved things if you allow yourself to feel it, a comfort different from the satisfaction of a puzzle finally solved. Not every question needs an answer to be worth sitting with quietly. Not every silence is a failure. Somewhere in a small churchyard, a man who wanted nothing more than to be left alone finally was, and has remained so for centuries. Undisturbed, his grave visited mostly by people who do not even know what they are looking at. There is something almost restful in that, in a story with no final answer, a mystery content to simply remain one. The way a house eventually settles into its foundations and stops asking anything more of the ground beneath it. And so we come, softly, to the end of the story, though not to the end of the mysteries themselves, because some things simply never get their final answer. Tonight, we sat with a girl who died in a silent house, and the three brothers who bargained with death itself before any of them ever set foot at Hogwarts. We followed a diadem lost for 1,000 years, and the lady who wore its curse long after she became something no longer quite alive. We saw a barren, single, unforgivable hour, and a chamber built for reasons its own maker never fully explained. We walked beside a brother who went alone into the dark and asked who first shaped a curse with no name attached to its making. We met a man who split his soul long before it had a word for what he had done, and a historian who knew far more than she ever safely said aloud. We followed a boy failed by the very laws meant to protect him, and a servant who told himself, again and again, that he had simply chosen to survive. We stood outside a prison built on an island of despair, and in front of a mirror that should never have been able to show what it showed. We considered a wizard who walked free for decades before any door finally closed on him, and a veil that has never once answered anyone who asked what lay beyond it. We remembered a shopkeeper who simply vanished, a father who judged his own blood, a room that keeps every secret it has ever given, and a grave so old and so quiet that the world simply forgot to ask about it at all. There is nothing left now that you must carry, and nothing here that requires an answer from you. Let each of these old, unresolved things sink away from you, down through still dark water, growing fainter and fainter until only calm remains. You are safe. You are whole. None of these mysteries can touch you, and nothing here asks anything of you. Let your breathing slow, and let the last of the day dissolve like mist over a quiet lake. Good night. If these old shadows carried you toward rest, stay with us, and let a gentle subscribe keep them coming. There are many more long, slow tales and many more mysteries waiting for the nights ahead.